Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Now let's begin with story 1, Frost on the Fields, the Siege of Novgorod in 1240. You might think that history is written by kings, generals, or scribes, but in Novgorod in the year 1240, it was written by something quieter, colder, and far more patient: snow. Imagine waking up to the dull gray of a midwinter dawn in Novgorod, a city of timber, riverbanks, and resilient traders. Snowdrifts bury the lesser-used lanes, and the frozen Volkhov River has become an unofficial road for sleighs and sleds. You can hear the creak of frost in the logs of homes, and see curls of smoke rising from chimneys trying to push back the deep cold. In this frigid silence, a war brews, though it is not always declared by trumpets or drums. The Mongol Empire had already swept through much of the known world, bringing entire kingdoms to their knees. But Novgorod, a key trade city in northern Rus, remained untouched for the moment. The people knew better than to assume they were safe. After all, Kiev had been sacked only a year earlier in a gruesome winter siege that left the city gutted and broken. Survivors had made their way north, speaking of flames on snow, of entire neighborhoods disappearing under ice and ash. In 1240, the threat was not immediate, but the air held a tension only peasants and soldiers recognize. Word reached the city via trembling merchants and disheveled monks. Badu Khan and his generals were moving westward. The Mongols were known for riding fast, striking hard, and perhaps most terrifying of all, doing so even in the dead of winter. Novgorod's natural defense, the winter terrain. What many don't realize is that Novgorod was not protected by walls alone. The city's position north of the Great Lakes, surrounded by swampland and dense forest, meant that it had an environmental defense stronger than many castles. Climate. Winter in Novgorod was not just cold, it was strategy. Paths disappeared under snowfall. Rivers, while frozen, were treacherous. Armor rusted from damp air. Horses broke legs on hidden ice. And in these conditions, the average Mongol soldier, a master horseman of the steppes, lost some of his natural advantage. But this was not a guarantee. The Mongols had learned to adapt. The peasant's perspective. Daily life did not pause. You perhaps are a peasant living in a small isba, a log cabin, your hands cracked from chopping ice off the family's well. You're used to survival being difficult. You grow root vegetables, store dried fish, mend fur cloaks. You know how to light a fire with wet wood and how to spot the difference between a frozen puddle and a dangerous ice sinkhole. These small details, hardly worth a chronicler's ink, were what made the people of Novgorod quietly formidable. As soldiers trained near the city walls, peasants far from the central Kremlin practiced their own forms of resistance, hiding grain, digging emergency root cellars, boiling pitch. In these months, community strength wasn't forged in battle, it was fermented in snow barrels, in warm ovens, and in whispered advice passed down through generations. Political cold fronts. Inside the wooden halls of the Vetch, the city's assembly, arguments flared almost as bitterly as the winds outside. Some wanted to negotiate with the approaching Mongols, citing the destruction of other cities. Others, particularly the merchant class, urged for full resistance. Trade routes were Novgorod's lifeline. Surrender might mean survival, but it would mean the end of their autonomy and likely their prosperity. Prince Alexander Yaroslavich, who would later be known as Alexander Nevsky, was only just emerging as a military leader. Young and cautious, he watched as his older counterparts debated over how to defend a city that couldn't truly be defended in the traditional sense. Not with walls, not with swords, not against an enemy that moved like a shadow and struck like frostbite, quiet, creeping, and devastating. Military preparations in the deep cold. The city's guards were ill-equipped for a modern winter war. The majority of soldiers were local militiamen who spent half the year farming, the other half watching for wolves or raiders. They wore lamellar armor, often poorly maintained, and most had never fought an enemy like the Mongols. Commanders ordered the clearing of paths for sleds, the stockpiling of salted fish, the freezing of large chunks of river ice for later water. Blacksmiths worked overtime, but metal was scarce. The real advantage wasn't in equipment, it was in knowledge of terrain. Scouts mapped out the snow-choked woods. Locals taught younger men how to recognize the sound of cracking ice beneath fresh snow. Small things, unremarkable things. You begin to see the theme. This story is not one of heroics and shining swords, but of shovels, tanned hides, and men learning how to sleep standing up so their boots didn't freeze to the ground. The Mongol threat. To the south, the Mongol advance paused. Some historians suggest it was due to the spring melt. Others argue that Novgorod was too far, too cold, or perhaps too unprofitable a target compared to richer cities further west. But the threat remained very real. What's most interesting and rarely discussed is that the Mongol strategy often used weather itself as a weapon. They knew European armies did not campaign in winter. They did. This alone provided psychological terror. They had learned to insulate their yurts, to wrap horse hooves in felt, to cook stews from preserved organs. They moved like frost, invisible until it was too late. The odd calm of late winter. And so the city waited. Patrols lit signal fires at dusk. Food was rationed, and rumors spread faster than any scout. Some claimed to have seen horsemen in the forests. Others said the Mongols had retreated entirely. Children were told to stay close, lest they vanish into the snow like so many had in other towns. But the attack never came that winter. Instead, Novgorod remained untouched, not out of mercy, but likely due to calculations, terrain, timing, and exhaustion. It's possible the Mongols intended to return after spring thaw. It's possible they simply didn't see Novgorod as worth the effort. But what if their hesitation was born of the deep snowbanks, the unfamiliar forests, the unassuming resilience of a cold city and colder people? The winter that bled without blood. This winter then becomes a strange chapter, a siege that never officially happened, a battle measured in firewood and frozen fish, not swords and arrows. It is often said that history remembers the victors, but sometimes it remembers the survivors, the ones who dug deeper instead of charging forward, the ones who learned to endure the weight of a silence that stretched from snow-covered rooftops to the very edge of the known world. And so the question lingers. If Novgorod had been attacked in the heart of winter, would its defenders have withstood the storm, or had the storm already done the defending for them? The siege that never came still left its scars. You would think a battle needs weapons to cause harm, but in Novgorod, the winter of 1240 told a different story. Here, the damage came in whispers and frostbite, in anxiety thick enough to settle like fresh snow. Though no arrows flew and no battering rams shattered gates, the entire city braced itself for death. The fear alone reshaped it. The psychological sea. To live under threat for months without release is its own kind of warfare. Imagine waking each morning wondering if today is the day the Mongol riders crest the distant ridge. Your ears strain to pick out the wind from the hoofbeats. Children grow quiet, their games changed. One week they build snowmen. The next, they shape small forts and pretend to throw stones. Anxiety becomes ritual. You check the frozen lock 3 times before bed. You sleep in shifts. You ration food not because you must, but because someone might soon need more. Your prayers get longer. You sharpen a blade you may never use. This was how Novgorod suffered, not in ruins, but in tension, a city held taut by expectation. Alexander Nevsky's calculated patience. Inside the walls, a quiet calculation unfolded. Prince Alexander Yaroslavich was barely 20. His father had fled south under Mongol pressure, leaving the young man with both the title and the threat. He did not yet carry the name Nevsky, nor had he won any major battles. But Alexander understood something crucial. Haste could kill a city faster than swords. Rather than ride south to engage the Mongols directly, He did something that might have seemed cowardly to other princes. He waited. He invested in scouts and river watchers. He met with the Vetch not as a tyrant but as a partner. In doing so, he kept the fragile unity of the merchant city intact. Some wanted war, some wanted surrender, but Alexander played for time, and time in this case meant snow. This young leader's restraint is often overlooked in favor of his later military feats. But this winter marked the first time he used the land itself as his ally. He leaned into what others feared: the frozen forests, the buried marsh paths, the white cover of terrain no outsider could read. Frozen diplomacy. Beyond the city walls, diplomacy took a different form. The Novgorodians sent quiet emissaries south, not to the Mongols directly, but to other Rus cities that had suffered. These messengers brought back chilling reports: whole communities erased, churches leveled, nobles slaughtered regardless of allegiance. But they also gathered a different kind of intelligence: how the Mongols had been slowed, what they avoided, and what they misunderstood. They learned that Mongol forces often misjudged northern forests. Their horsemen became less effective in the deep woods, especially when snowdrifts masked obstacles and trails disappeared in frost fog. They hated ice on narrow bridges. Their siege engines faltered in wet, cold conditions, especially if local defenders blocked river crossings. These details became Novgorod's best defense, not in swords but in knowledge, in absence. The siege that wasn't but could be. What would a winter siege on Novgorod have looked like? Let's indulge the historical possibility. A Mongol vanguard arrives at dusk, their scouts already chilled. They find no dry wood for fires, only snow-laden pines. The local scouts have long since pulled back, burning caches and collapsing footbridges. River crossings are slick and brittle. They lose 2 horses in the first attempt. By dawn, they attempt to surround the city, but the frozen Volkhov River is unstable. Their carts sink through the thinnest spots. Siege towers, transported across treacherous terrain, crack under their own weight in sub-zero weather. Arrows fly short in cold air. And then there's the noise, none. The silence of a northern forest in winter can unnerve even the most disciplined warrior. The creak of tree limbs mimics voices. Footsteps vanish in snowfall. Torches fail to stay lit. It's not that the defenders are strong, it's that the land itself feels cursed. No songs of war, no glory. Just survival in quiet, bitter white. Merchants, money, and mistrust. Even in fear, commerce didn't fully stop. Novgorod's position on the Hanseatic trade route meant it was never truly isolated. German merchants continued cautiously bringing goods, hopping to exploit demand caused by siege paranoia. Prices soared. Salted meat became more expensive than silver jewelry. Fur traders became wealthier than minor nobles. This disparity bred tension within the city. Some accused the merchant class of hoarding. Others suspected German traders of spying for the Mongols. A few low-level nobles took advantage of the chaos to seize warehouses or claim abandoned properties. A quiet class war simmered beneath the snow. But Alexander, still politically green, refused to let this boil over. He instituted modest price controls. He allowed the Vetch to oversee food stores. His subtle choices kept the city from consuming itself while the enemy lingered somewhere in the woods. Peasant resilience and rural realities. Meanwhile, outside the city, beyond its protective walls, peasants survived by centuries-old traditions. Some buried food in snow pits. Others built temporary shelters far from known paths, hiding livestock under brush and snow-laced canopies. There are stories largely forgotten of entire families pretending their homes had been abandoned, only to emerge weeks later once danger passed. These quiet stories of survival rarely make it into chronicles, but they are just as heroic. A boy learned how to hunt hare using snares his grandmother taught him to make from old fishing twine. A mother taught her daughter how to read birch bark messages in the snow, tracing routes left by retreating neighbors. An old man froze his boots on purpose so that he wouldn't be tempted to run when Mongol scouts passed near his woodshed. This was resistance, not in battles but in being too stubborn to die. Rumors of the South. As spring neared, new rumors trickled into the city. Kiev had fallen, Vladimir had burned, but more shockingly, the Mongols had begun to pull back some claim due to the death of Great Khan Urgedei in far-off Karakoram. The empire, vast and complex, needed its princes to return east for the succession. It's one of those small footnotes of history that changes everything. Had Urgedei lived a year longer, the campaign might have resumed. Novgorod might have burned, but death travels faster than horsemen. The call back to Mongolia may have saved the northern Rus cities without them ever raising a blade. Alexander, ever the cautious observer, did not celebrate openly. He knew this reprieve was not necessarily permanent. Lessons in waiting. And so, Novgorod entered spring neither victorious nor defeated. The siege that never came left behind a different kind of memory, one of vigilance, of nerves frayed like old rope, of community stress and unity alike. There were no monuments, no war songs, no glorious tombs, but every frost-scarred stable, every hoarded sack of barley, every handmade snowshoe carried the weight of what could have been. In the years that followed, Novgorod would come to revere this winter not for what happened, but for what didn't. And Alexander. He learned that sometimes the best military move is not to charge into battle, but to prepare the ground so thoroughly that the enemy thinks twice about entering. So now the question becomes, was this near siege a sign of Novgorod's strength, or a lucky escape that taught its people all the wrong lessons? Spring does not arrive quickly in Novgorod. It creeps, subtle and suspicious, like a scout unsure of enemy terrain. The snow melts unevenly, creating shallow pools in alleyways and soggy patches in market squares. The river begins to move again not in sudden torrents, but in cautious pulses, like a creature waking from hibernation. And so the siege that never came slowly dissolved, not with battle horns or victorious cheers, but with the steady drip of thawing icicles. And yet, in that slow return to normalcy, something new took root in Novgorod, something quiet and long-lasting. Alexander's emergence as a ruler. For Prince Alexander, this non-siege was no less a trial than a battlefield skirmish. In the absence of war, he had governed. In the absence of clear threat, he had prepared. And in the absence of triumph, he had learned patience. His youth was, paradoxically, his strength. Where older leaders might have clung to outdated tactics or charged headlong into glory, Alexander had stood still. He had watched the river freeze and listened to the silence of forests. He had weighed words more carefully than weapons. And perhaps most importantly, he had not broken under the strain of waiting. His decisions had preserved a fragile unity in a divided city. The merchants were appeased. The vetch remained functioning. The peasants, though burdened, were not abandoned. For a man barely old enough to command his own household, this was no small feat. That spring, Alexander did not walk taller. He walked quieter but with more people watching. The aftermath of a non-siege. When a city survives a siege, it usually marks the moment with stories of heroism, rebuilt walls, and ballads sung in fire-lit halls. But what does a city do when the siege never truly happened? In Novgorod's case, it recorded almost nothing. The chronicles of the time, sparse and monkishly minimalist, make only passing mention of Mongol scouts near the region in 1240. There is no detailed account of food shortages, no listing of defensive actions, no dramatic declarations from Alexander. It's as if the silence had infected the scribes, too. Yet archaeological evidence and merchant records hint at a city that paused its heartbeat. Trade volumes dipped. Imports of iron tools declined. There's a recorded spike in fur prices, particularly wolf and fox, good for warmth and lining helmets. The people remembered the fear, even if the chronicles didn't. In oral traditions, there lingered stories of the year of deep snow, of Alexander's quiet watch, of the invisible enemy that the river turned away. Grandmothers whispered these to children while knitting woolen socks. They weren't war tales, they were survival tales. Alexander turns west, a new threat approaches. Even before the frost fully retreated, new threats emerged not from the east this time, but from the west. Swedish forces, emboldened by chaos and ruse, and likely unaware of the Mongol threat, began pressing into the region near Lake Ladoga. Their goal: to assert influence over the trade routes and religious direction of the northern territories. And so, the prince who had learned patience during the frozen siege was soon forced to act. Later that same year, still 1240, Alexander led Novgorodian forces to the mouth of the Neva River. There, he launched a sudden and devastating counterattack on the Swedish invaders, reportedly catching them while they still lay in their tents. It is from this moment that Alexander earned the title Nevsky of the Neva. The irony is profound. He earned his fame not from the long winter that tested every fiber of the city's endurance, but from a brief clash on a riverbank in summer. Glory, it seems, prefers moments that can be easily painted in vivid colors. But those who lived through the long cold remembered differently. The forgotten army of peasants. If you look in the official records, you'll find very little about the peasants who braced the city's outskirts during that winter. You'll read nothing about the women who dug emergency latrines so frozen waste wouldn't pollute the river. There will be no names for the farmers who brought frozen hares and smoked fish into the city at personal risk. But they were there. A local priest's journal, never intended for public reading, speaks of a man who walked for 3 days in snow up to his chest to bring word of enemy scouts, and of the grandmother who taught militia how to store kindling inside their cloaks to keep it dry. These stories may never have been carved into church walls or celebrated in feasts, but they kept the city alive in a different way. They reminded people that survival was often a matter of many small, dull efforts rather than a single stroke of a sword. Climate and campaigning, a larger pattern. The siege of Novgorod was not unique. Across medieval Europe and Central Asia, climate shaped strategy in profound but often ignored ways. In general, most medieval armies avoided campaigning in deep winter. Mud, snow, and ice could render even the best army into a chaotic mess. Siege equipment froze, horses starved, food spoiled, armor became liabilities in icy terrain. But the Mongols had challenged this norm. Their ability to fight year-round made them terrifying. They used winter as an element of surprise. It worked against many, but not Novgorod. Here, the climate turned on them. The forests and rivers of the northern Rus region, paired with a people conditioned to endure them, created a natural stalemate. It wasn't heroism that stopped the Mongols. It was snow, geography, and human adaptation. This raises an interesting question for historians. How many other battles were decided not by generals, but by frost? What the silence meant. In the centuries that followed, Novgorod would rise and fall in influence, eventually absorbed into the growing power of Moscow. But the winter of 1240 left an imprint deeper than most care to notice. It proved that fear could be weaponized, but so could silence. That sometimes, not reacting was the most powerful move. That snow, in its simplicity, could deter even the mightiest empire on earth. And in Alexander Nevsky, the city found a leader shaped not by dramatic victories, but by restraint and careful governance. Even in his later campaigns, most notably the battle on the ice in 1242, Alexander would use his understanding of terrain and whether to trap and defeat the Teutonic Knights. He had learned his lessons not from books, but from the frozen stillness of a winter that demanded stillness in return. A final reflection. So, what is the legacy of this quiet winter siege? It is not written in stone or song. It is whispered through snowfalls and wood smoke, through routines passed down generations: how to bind snowshoes, how to listen to trees grown under ice, how to recognize the shape of human tracks in fresh drifts. It is remembered not by historians but by survivors, not by what was destroyed but by what was not. And so we ask one final time, what if the greatest victories in history are the ones where no one ever raised a sword? Story 2, White Silence, how the Battle of Toten turned with snow. You've heard of battles fought in glory, where kings clash and flags wave proudly. But the Battle of Toten, fought on March 29, 1461, offers no such romance. It is known quietly, chillingly, as the bloodiest single-day battle on English soil. Yet it began not with blood but with snow. Step with me into the landscape of 15th century Yorkshire. The fields lie sodden with early spring thaw, still pocked by frost and churned by retreating feet. The village of Toten is barely more than a smudge on the landscape: modest cottages, barns, and a scattering of hearths fighting against the season's cold breath. The Wars of the Roses have dragged England into a grim civil conflict, and this small village will soon become the eye of a storm. But first, silence, white silence. England's civil war. The Wars of the Roses, pitting the House of Lancaster, Red Rose, against the House of York, White Rose, were a series of dynastic conflicts marked less by open warfare and more by brutal politics, sudden betrayals, and a rotating cast of nobles changing allegiances. By 1461, the war had escalated beyond backroom deals and into the mud of open conflict. Edward, Duke of York, newly proclaimed King Edward IV, was marching north to solidify his claim after deposing the Lancastrian King Henry VI. His opponents, loyalists to the mentally fragile Henry and his politically savvy queen, Margaret of Anjou, rallied their forces to stop him near Toten. It wasn't the site of a great fortress or rich city. It was just there, a meeting point shaped by terrain, timing, and crucially weather. The day before, positioning in the cold. The armies didn't simply arrive at Toten. They slid toward it like opposing glaciers. Yorkist forces, estimated at over 20,000 men, arrived from the south. They were better supplied but fatigued. Many had marched in damp wool and rust-stained armor, sleeping in fields rimmed with frost. They bore the wind in their faces. The Lancastrians, under the command of Henry Beaufort and the Earl of Northumberland, occupied the higher ground to the north, about 30,000 strong. They had the weather to their backs and the terrain to their favor. On the eve of battle, snow began to fall. It wasn't unusual for late March in Yorkshire, but the timing was decisive. Thick, wind-driven flakes began coating the field. Visibility dropped, sounds muffled. Campfires flickered in the wind and men huddled under cloaks already stiff with ice. No one slept well. If you had walked among them that night, you would have seen little gestures of fear. Rosaries gripped too tight, small carvings of saints tucked into gauntlets, mud-smeared boys barely old enough to hold spears shaking from cold, not fear or perhaps both. The role of snow in medieval warfare. We often think of snow in battle as mere background, a detail for paintings or movie sets. But in the 15th century, snow changed everything. Snow slowed movement. It dulled swords. It blurred the enemy's position. It ruined bowstrings. It confused signals, muffled horns, disguised direction. For medieval commanders who relied on flags, horns, and runners to issue orders, visibility was not a luxury, it was a necessity. Moreover, the cold affected morale. English soldiers, already underfed and underpaid, did not fight with the vigor of mythical warriors. They fought because they were told to, or because their lord demanded it, or because they'd taken the coin. The snow made them slower, colder, angrier. And as we'll soon see, it may have turned the tide of battle. Arrows in the wind. When the battle began the next morning, the wind was blowing south from the Lancastrians toward the Yorkists. Snow came with it, stinging the Yorkist front lines. The Lancastrians, on higher ground, saw dim shadows of enemy ranks and launched volleys of arrows. And here is where the snow this quiet, indifferent phenomenon made its mark. The wind carried Lancastrian arrows short. Many fell harmlessly. The Yorkists, led by Lord Fauconberg, Edward IV's uncle, noticed this. He ordered his archers to step forward and fire into the wind. Their arrows, aided by gusts, reached the enemy lines. But it didn't stop there. Yorkist archers then pulled a cunning move. They advanced, fired, then stepped back, inviting the Lancastrians to respond. When they did, their arrows fell short again, embedding in the field between the armies. The Yorkists collected these arrows and fired them back. The Lancastrians' own arrows were turned against them, their own momentum, once an advantage, now used as a trap. Muddying the field. After the archery volleys, the melee began. Tens of thousands surged into the space between the armies, crashing into each other with the dull thud of metal on flesh. It was not an elegant clash. It was not chivalric or clean. It was slogging, freezing, breath-stealing brutality. The field, already saturated from thawing frost, became a slurry of blood, mud, and melting snow. Men slipped, horses panicked, formations broke, helmets cracked, orders disintegrated. If you were there, you might not even see your enemy until he was a sword's length away. Snow and fog closed visibility to mere feet. Battle lines dissolved. The fight became one long, chaotic brawl, a fight in which the weather itself dictated the tempo. The toll of temperature. Combat in cold weather is not just harder, it's deadlier. Muscles cramp faster, fingers lose dexterity, frostbite sets in even as blood leaks from wounds. Infection rates spike in days that follow if anyone survives. A blow to the arm in summer might be shrugged off. In snow, it could be fatal. A limp meant you slipped. A fall meant you were trampled. Armor got heavier with wet snow caking the joints. Sword grips turned slick with ice and blood. One account from a later chronicler notes, simply, the dead lay frozen in place. Not from some poetic metaphor, but literal truth. Snow preserved corpses in positions of terror, their last breath exhaled in icy air, never followed by another. What the common soldiers saw. For the average soldier, there was no grand strategy, no sight of banners, no knowledge of whether their side was winning. Just the snow, the mud, the press of bodies, the heaving panic of trying to stay on your feet or trying not to be noticed by someone with a bigger blade. There are tales rare, scattered, of men who ran and got stuck in drifted snowbanks, of horses that slipped into frozen bogs, of entire companies separated by fog and rejoining the fight hours later, only to discover they'd circled into enemy lines. The snow made everything equal. Titles didn't matter. Armor helped, but only to a point. If you fell and couldn't rise quickly, someone else's desperation would finish you. But then comes the crucial question. What if the snow had not fallen? What if visibility had been perfect, the archers could judge their distance clearly, the ground had been dry and firm? Would the outcome and England's throne have shifted with the weather? The snow did not let up. As morning dragged into midday on that cold Palm Sunday in 1461, the storm over Toten remained steady, thickening the fog of war, numbing limbs and obscuring the dead. The air tasted like metal and wet wool. The ground, churned by thousands of boots and hooves, resembled a stew of mud, blood, and melting snow. But even in this disorienting chaos, the killing did not stop. It is often called the bloodiest day in English history. But it was also one of the most silent. Not in terms of sound, surely the field echoed with groans and steel and the wet slap of weapons, but in terms of record. Few first-hand accounts survive. Few nobles bothered to remember the names of the thousands who fell. But if you were to imagine that field, if you were there, The weight of snow pressing down on the dying would speak volumes. The middle hours stalemate in the storm. By noon, both armies were fully engaged. Estimates vary, but the combined force may have exceeded 50,000 men. In 15th century England, this was unheard of. Most battles involved a few thousand at most. This was not a skirmish. This was national civil war made manifest. The Yorkists had drawn first blood through archery, but now both armies were locked in brutal hand-to-hand combat. There was no flanking maneuver, no cavalry sweep. The snow was too thick, the terrain too boggy. Lines of men simply clashed, broke, reformed, and clashed again. Most of these soldiers were not knights. They were levied men, farmers, tradesmen, the working poor conscripted by their lords. They fought not for ideology, but for bread, coin, or survival. And the snow punished them all equally. Cold made the fingers slow, sword grips slipped, polearms cracked, leather stiffened. Many men fought with improvised weapons after theirs broke or were lost in the sludge. Helmets iced over. Vision narrowed to the foot of space in front of one's nose. No one had perspective on the full battle. It was, as one later chronicler said, not so much a fight as a pushing of men into death. The arrival of Norfolk, the turning point. For hours the battle remained at a grim equilibrium, but around mid-afternoon a new force arrived, the Duke of Norfolk and his troops' fresh Yorkist reinforcements. They struck the Lancastrian left flank, their approach concealed by snow and fog. In normal conditions, the Lancastrians might have seen them coming from the ridge. But in this storm, the reinforcements seemed to appear out of nowhere. Some accounts say they were mistaken for retreating Lancastrians until it was too late. This flank attack broke the balance. Lancastrians, already fatigued and numbed by hours of continuous fighting, began to waver. Leaders fell. Confusion rippled down the line. And in battle, confusion is as deadly as a blade. As the Yorkist line surged forward, the Lancastrian retreat became a rout. Panic spread like frostbite quietly, invisibly, and then all at once. The flight to the river. Retreating Lancastrians fled north toward the River Cock and the village of Tadcaster. But here, snow and geography conspired against them once again. The terrain sloped downward toward the river. In dry weather, this would be a manageable retreat. But after hours of snowfall, fighting, and melted frost, the field had become a slick incline of churned mud. Men slipped, horses collapsed, armor weighed down the injured. Some removed their helmets to breathe easier only to be cut down from behind. At the river crossing, chaos reigned. The small wooden bridges could not hold the crush of bodies. Some collapsed, others clogged with the weight of men pushing, screaming, falling. Hundreds, possibly thousands, drowned or were trampled. The Cock River turned red with blood, its icy waters choking the wounded and the innocent alike. Later it was said that the bodies dammed the stream, and the snow turned pink for days. It was here, in retreat, that most of the deaths occurred not in valorous combat, but in the desperate collapse of discipline and cohesion. The role of weather in defeat. It would be simple to say that Norfolk's reinforcements won the battle, and in terms of timing, yes, they were decisive, but their impact was multiplied exponentially by weather. The snow concealed their arrival, preventing early countermeasures. Masked the battlefield, making it impossible for Lancastrians to see their collapsing flank. Turned the retreat into a death trap, rendering the ground unmanageable for flight. This is the unsung influence of snow on Toten. It turned what could have been an orderly withdrawal into a stampede of slaughter. It made every stumble fatal. It punished hesitation. It offered no cover, only confusion. Post-battle butchery. Most medieval battles ended when one side fled or surrendered. Toten was different. The Yorkists, furious and triumphant, did not offer quarter. Edward IV had declared that no mercy would be shown to rebels, and his men followed orders with grim efficiency. Fleeing soldiers were hunted down and killed even after throwing down their weapons. Some were slaughtered in nearby fields, barns, and woods where they sought shelter from the cold. The snow bore witness to all of it. Later chroniclers, even those favoring Edward, referred to the killings as righteous fury or purification. But those words do little to comfort the imagined faces of those who died, unrecorded beneath a drifting March sky. Some estimates claim as many as 28,000 men died in a single day, a staggering number for the time. The forgotten foot soldiers. Most of those killed at Toten were not titled. They left behind no family crests, no heraldic shields to be catalogued in armorial rolls. They were simply gone. Their wives and children, miles away, received no notification. They simply watched the roads, waited by village gates, and slowly accepted silence as their answer. For years afterward, human bones surfaced in the fields after heavy rains. Farmers plowed around unmarked graves. Snowmelt revealed skulls frozen beneath layers of earth. And still the land remembered. The quiet of aftermath. As night fell, the snow ceased. The wind calmed, the smoke thinned, and silence, true silence, returned to the field, broken only by the occasional moan, the cry of a wounded man still breathing beneath corpses, or the hollow howl of wind through snapped banners. Edward IV emerged from this horror not just victorious, but solidified as king. Yet the foundation of his reign was built on bodies. The Battle of Toten ended the primary phase of the Wars of the Roses, but it also marked a turning point in the role of weather in English warfare. Commanders would henceforth consider wind, snow, and visibility not just as nuisances, but as tactical elements. And so the question lingers. Was Edward IV's victory a result of leadership, or did the snow do the slaughtering for him? The Battle of Toten did not end with a declaration. It ended with exhaustion. By the time the last sword was sheathed and the final scream faded into the snow-muted dusk, the fields around the village were no longer battlegrounds, they were cemeteries. Hasty, shallow graves were dug where the ground allowed. Where it didn't, bodies simply remained where they had fallen. Some were stripped of armor. Some were buried still clenching their swords. But long after the banners were lowered, the snow continued to fall. And that snow, in a strange way, became a kind of memory. The crown on a frozen field. Edward IV's claim to the English throne had been a contested gamble. Young, ambitious, and only recently declared king by his Yorkist peers, he needed a decisive moment, something that would make rebellion seem futile. Toten gave him that, or more precisely, the snow gave him that. Victory alone wasn't enough. It had to be total, brutal, unmistakable. Toten's victory and the way it had been won sent a message across the kingdom. The Yorkists were not merely claimants. They were survivors of the coldest, cruelest test the Civil War had yet devised. Edward's crown was sealed not with a coronation, but with carnage. And for once in medieval history, weather played as much of a role in politics as did bloodlines. A landscape haunted by weather. In the months that followed the battle, travelers passing through the Toten region described odd scenes. Wolves or wild dogs seen prowling near the riverbanks, children warned not to play in certain parts of the woods. Some said snow refused to melt properly in the killing fields. Whether myth or memory, these whispers reflected something very real. The land had been changed. Spring came late to Toten that year. When it did, it brought the scent of death carried in thawed soil. The river Cock, clogged with bodies during the battle, ran slower for weeks. Villagers found bone fragments in their fields for years afterward. And the snow, ironically, had preserved much of it. In later centuries, archaeologists and farmers would find remarkably well-preserved skeletons. Cold acts as nature's freezer, halting decay. Some of the corpses still bore traces of their wounds, slashes to the jaw, punctures to the skull, shattered limbs from maces or hammers. These were not cinematic deaths. These were deliberate, repetitive, brutal killings. Snow doesn't just conceal, it remembers. The dead that history forgot. Toten is remembered in some chronicles, yes. It appears in military histories and royal genealogies, but rarely do we learn about the men who died there beyond vague numbers. The dead became a statistic, the snow their shroud. Yet scattered fragments remain. In 1996, a mass grave was uncovered near the battlefield. Forensic evidence showed signs of extreme trauma. Some skulls had been struck multiple times even after death. Many victims were young, some with still developing bones, suggesting they were teenagers. Malnourishment and bone stress indicated that many were not professional soldiers, but peasants conscripted into service. These men didn't choose to fight, they chose to survive. And the snow, indifferent as ever, gave them no favor. The legacy of weather in war. Toten's snow wasn't the first time weather altered the fate of an army, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But it stands as a prime example of how medieval warfare was shaped by forces beyond human control. Commanders in the centuries that followed learned to read the skies as much as maps. Weather became an element of strategy. Campaigning calendars were adjusted. Scouts learned to test the ground not just for enemy movement, but for soil firmness. Even kings, once confident in divine right, began to fear winter. In a strange way, the snow at Toten democratized the battlefield. Lords, knights, foot soldiers, everyone was equally vulnerable to the cold, the mud, the confusion of low visibility. It was not chivalry that determined who lived or died. It was who slipped, who turned too late, who stood on unstable ground. Toten in the national memory. Despite its scale and significance, Toten rarely holds a central place in popular English history, perhaps because it lacks the dramatic flair of battles like Hastings, or perhaps because it was too ugly, too cold, too muddy, too real. There were no great speeches, no gallant last stands, no cinematic heroism, just hours of hacking, stumbling, suffocating, and freezing. But in that, it tells us something important about the nature of history. So much of the past is not made in grand moments. It is made in the push and pull of ordinary men under extraordinary pressures, often shaped more by environment than ideology. Toten is not a legend. It is a warning, a story not of glory but of grim survival. Snow as silence and symbol. The snow at Toten serves both as a literal weather event and as a symbolic filter. It muffled the sounds of battle, turning chaos into whitewashed horror. It distorted vision, ensuring that no one truly saw the full scope of what they were part of. It covered the dead, preserving their agony long enough for later generations to rediscover it. In this way, the snow acts like memory itself, selective, obscuring, preserving only fragments. And perhaps that is the final legacy of Toten. Not the Yorkist crown, not the number of dead, but the realization that silence can sometimes say more than celebration. A thought from the edge of the field. Imagine walking that field today. The snow falls lightly as it did 5.5 centuries ago. The landscape is open, wind-swept. No monuments scream their presence. Just an old stone cross, a modest memorial, a name on a weathered plaque. You pause and listen. No screams, no horns, just wind in the hedgerows and the muffled crunch of boots on snow. But still you wonder, did those soldiers know, in their final moments, that they were not dying in a noble clash of kings, but in a snowstorm that would forget their names, even as it remembered their bones? Story 3, The Ice March, Alexander Nevsky and the Frozen Lake Battle. You may know Alexander Nevsky as a Russian hero, a saint, a warrior prince, a defender of faith. But before he was any of those things, he was a young commander staring across a frozen lake in the biting wind of April, 1242, calculating the silence between two armies. And before there was a battle on the ice, there was a march, a cold, methodical, and brutal one across frost-bitten rivers, pine-choked forests, and narrow tracks worn smooth by sleighs and hooves. This was not a charge to glory. It was a quiet grind toward survival. A borderland under pressure. Lake Peipus, straddling modern Estonia and Russia, was never just a body of water. It marked a threshold, a cultural, religious, and political border between Orthodox Rus to the east and the expanding Catholic orders to the west. By the early 13th century, the Teutonic Knights, an elite Germanic military order, had begun to push eastward into the Baltic and Slavic lands. Backed by papal blessing and Western nobility, they claimed they were spreading Christianity. But the people of Novgorod were already Christian, Orthodox Christian. And what the Teutonic Knights sought was not conversion, but control. In 1240, the same year Mongols threatened from the south, a western front opened. The Livonian Order, a branch of the Teutonic Knights, seized Pskov, a city tied to Novgorod culturally and economically. This wasn't just territorial, it was ideological. The Rus saw it as an invasion by Latin Christians into Orthodox lands. The Papal Crusade had quietly changed direction. The call for Alexander. Alexander Yaroslavich, still in his early 20s, had already proven himself. Months earlier, he had defended Novgorod from a Swedish incursion at the Battle of the Neva. This victory earned him his sobriquet, Nevsky. But Novgorod's politics were never stable. After his victory, Alexander was forced into temporary exile by the Merchant Council, the Vetch, wary of his growing popularity and military leanings. When Pskov fell and German knights fortified their positions near the lake, Novgorod called him back. You can imagine the young prince, now seasoned, perhaps slightly hardened, riding through snow-patched birch forests, hearing the cries of returning villagers, seeing burnt farmsteads near the western border. He accepted the call, not out of ambition, but out of understanding. Novgorod stood on the edge of a blade. The Mongols pressed from the east. The Germans advanced from the west. The land between could not afford division. Winter war preparations. By early 1242, Alexander began preparing a counterattack. His army was a patchwork: Novgorodian militia, horse archers from the surrounding countryside, and a corps of loyal boyars and warriors. Most were not professionals. They wore padded coats, kaftans, fur cloaks, and iron helmets of mixed quality. Their swords were serviceable but limited. Some carried axes. Others bore long spears tipped with iron. Crucially, they knew the land, and they knew the cold. Alexander did not aim for immediate confrontation. He harassed German supply lines. He recaptured Pskov in a winter campaign, surprising the garrison with speed and maneuverability. Then he withdrew toward Lake Peipus, baiting the enemy. This was not rash, this was patience. The lake itself. Lake Peipus is massive, one of the largest in Europe. In April, it remains frozen in most years, but the ice is deceptive. Near the center, it is thick. Near the shallows, it is thin. And where rivers feed in or out, it fractures easily. Only those who live near it understand its moods. Alexander understood. The terrain around the lake is open, flat, and treacherous in thawing months. Roads disappear beneath melting snow. Patches of ice alternate with patches of waterlogged earth. To fight near the lake was a risk. To fight on it, that bordered on madness. But the Livonian Order did not believe they would be forced onto the ice. They were professional crusaders, armored and mounted. Their heavy cavalry was feared across Europe. They wore chainmail, surcoats bearing black crosses, and thick leather gloves laced with metal rings. On dry land, they were unstoppable. But this wasn't dry land. The frozen approach. Alexander's army moved cautiously. Scouts marked ice depth using long poles. Supply sleds trailed behind. Horses were outfitted with hide wrappings for better traction. Archers kept their bows under fur to prevent string snap from cold. Fires were lit low to avoid detection from smoke. This wasn't just a military maneuver, it was a migration through cold. They encamped near the narrow strait between Lake Peipus and Lake Pskov, an area known for unstable ice and shifting wind. Alexander knew the Germans would have to cross here if they pursued, and he waited. Faith and frost. As the armies positioned, this was more than a clash of swords. It was a clash of cosmologies. The Teutonic Knights believed themselves agents of divine order, holy warriors purging heresy. They considered Orthodox Christianity corrupt, misaligned with Rome, and in need of correction by sword if necessary. Alexander and his people, meanwhile, saw their religion not just as identity but as refuge. In a world of Mongol pressure, collapsing trade routes, and shifting borders, orthodoxy was their constant. So prayers were said beneath the snow-laced trees. Icons were kissed. Crosses were drawn in the air before battle. This was not just a territorial dispute. It was a frozen war of belief. The day before the battle. On April 4th, 1242, the German forces numbering roughly 2,500 marched toward Alexander's encampment. Their scouts had underreported the terrain. They believed they were pressing a retreating enemy. They had no idea what lay ahead. Alexander allowed them to come. His army, likely twice their number, waited behind a rise near the edge of the lake. Light cavalry fanned out in the flanks. Archers prepared positions along the shallows. He did not give a speech, he gave orders. And he watched the wind pick up over the frozen lake. And here we must ask, how much of Alexander's genius lay in his faith and tactics, and how much in his intimate knowledge of where the ice would break? The morning of April 5th, 1242, was gray and still. The frozen surface of Lake Peipus stretched like a sheet of cold glass beneath a leaden sky. Thin wisps of wind dragged snow across the ice, erasing tracks almost as quickly as they were made. The Livonian Order Teutonic Knights and their allies approached the lake's edge under the impression that they were chasing a retreating Rus force. Instead, they were entering a carefully chosen trap, set not with walls or spikes, but with patience, terrain, and weather. And as their iron boots struck the frozen surface, the ice groaned. The German advance. The German forces, led by Hermann of Dorpat and Grand Master Andreas von Velven, deployed in classic Teutonic formation. Heavily armored cavalry formed the vanguard, a wedge, or kale meant to drive through enemy lines. Behind them marched infantry lighter, but still burdened by mail and cross-shaped surcoats. Estonian conscripts filled the rear ranks, many of them pulled into the crusade by political pressure, not piety. They had confidence in discipline, confidence in the cross, confidence in their horses, their training, their armor. But they lacked confidence in the ice. The German scouts had failed to assess the condition of the frozen lake. To them, the broad white plain ahead seemed solid enough. But Alexander Nevsky's men had been preparing for weeks. They knew exactly where the ice was thick and where it was not. Alexander's hidden army. Unlike the Germans, Alexander kept his formation loose and layered. He placed his infantry in a broad arc on firmer ground near the lake's edge, with marshes and trees to their flanks. His cavalry was hidden behind low ridges and ice hummocks. Most crucially, he did not commit all at once. He waited. As the Germans advanced across the frozen surface, their heavy horses began to slip slightly. Ice cracked beneath them, not enough to collapse, but enough to unsettle. Snow squalls swirled unpredictably, cutting visibility. The sound of boots and hoofbeats on ice was haunting, brittle, echoing, fragile. And then, at the right moment, Alexander gave the signal. The ambush. As the Teutonic wedge neared the Rus infantry, archers emerged from the flanks and unleashed volleys of arrows. The snow-muffled landscape gave the attack an eerie quiet. No drums, no horns, just a sudden hiss of shafts and the screams of pierced men and horses. Then the Rus infantry absorbed the impact of the German charge not by blocking it entirely, but by bending. They retreated slightly, drawing the Germans further onto the lake. And then, like shadows breaking from trees, Alexander's cavalry struck from both sides. Light horsemen circled the flanks of the Teutonic formation, attacking with short spears and sabers. They moved faster than the German knights could respond. The ice beneath them, relatively thin, had been chosen precisely because it would not support too much weight in one place for too long. The breaking of the ice. Chroniclers from the time, both Russian and German, speak of the ice breaking, though modern historians debate how much actually gave way. The more likely scenario is that the fighting shifted into the marginal, thinning zones of the lake's edge, where cracks had formed naturally. There, the combination of weight, movement, and melting conditions may have opened fissures. Armored knights on horseback were particularly vulnerable. Their gear weighed over 50 pounds, not including weaponry. Once dismounted, many could not rise again. If they fell into icy water, hypothermia set in within minutes. If they tried to swim, their armor pulled them under. Horses panicked, thrashing and crushing nearby soldiers. Some sank into the lake, some froze in place, some died before they even understood what had gone wrong. Battlefield chaos. Accounts describe the German formation shattering like glass under pressure. Those who tried to retreat found themselves funneled toward narrowing ice paths, only to be met by Rus cavalry slashing from behind. Others fled toward what they thought was safer ground, only to be bogged down in slushy shallows. Meanwhile, the Rus archers kept up a steady fire, targeting commanders and banners. The Teutonic Order's black crosses disappeared into the white mist, swallowed by a terrain that refused to cooperate. What made this moment remarkable was not just the loss of life, but the helplessness. The Teutonic Knights, who had bested Muslim armies in the Holy Land and Baltic pagans in Lithuania, were undone not by superior steel, but by snow, by patience, by terrain they didn't understand. The psychological collapse. Once their wedge failed, the Teutonic ranks began to crumble. Discipline disintegrated. Some knights dismounted, trying to continue the fight on foot, but the ice made even walking difficult. Rus infantry closed in from the front while cavalry circled behind. By late afternoon, the field was no longer a battlefield. It was a slaughter. Eyewitnesses claimed the ice was littered with corpses, some frozen mid-fall, some still grasping swords, their eyes open to the sky. Some tried to crawl toward the lake's edge, only to be pulled back by their own freezing muscles. Others sank into water too dark to reflect the clouds. The battle had lasted less than a day, but its effects would last centuries. Hermann of Dorpat escapes. Hermann of Dorpat, one of the Teutonic commanders, barely escaped with his life. Some say he fled on horseback across the cracking lake. Others claim he was wounded and pulled from the ice by Estonian footmen. Either way, his retreat marked the final collapse of the Crusader army. Few Teutonic knights survived. Some were captured and ransomed. Many simply vanished into the ice. Alexander's restraint. In victory, Alexander Nevsky showed unusual moderation. Rather than pressing further into Livonian territory, he halted. He understood that the battle had been a defensive victory, not a pretext for conquest. His message had been clear. Novgorod would not bend to the west. Its faith, its people, and its forests would resist. He sent the prisoners back with a warning. Let the river and the snow mark the line between us. The Pope, hearing of the defeat, made no further effort to push eastward through military means. The ice that saved orthodoxy. In later centuries, Russian historians would elevate the battle on the ice to near mythical status. Orthodox Christianity had survived not only Mongol pressure, but a Western crusade. And it had done so not through divine miracles, but through knowledge of land, patience, and calculated use of weather. Lake Peipus became more than a lake. It became a symbol, not of victory but of resilience. Snow had hidden Alexander's cavalry. Ice had betrayed the enemy. Cold had broken their charge. Nature itself had sided with the defender not because it cared, but because it was understood. And so we must wonder, had the weather been warmer that day, would Nevsky's army have held the line, or would the faith of a people have shattered like ice under iron? The ice eventually melted. In the weeks after the Battle of Lake Peipus, the spring thaw arrived across the Novgorod frontier. Cracks widened across the battlefield. Bodies once frozen stiff beneath snow and slush were swallowed into the dark waters. Horses, armor, and men drifted to the bottom, entombed in silence beneath a still, glassy surface. But the memory of what happened there did not thaw. It settled into chronicles, into stories whispered by firesides, and eventually into legend. Victory without triumph. After the battle, Alexander Nevsky did not parade through Novgorod with banners and spoils. There were no mass executions, no scorched cities. The victory had been clear, but it had also been grim. Estimates of German and Allied casualties vary, but some sources claim that over 400 knights perished, along with hundreds more Estonian and Livonian foot soldiers. For a small crusading army, these were devastating losses. Nevsky's own forces had suffered too. Some died in the retreating push across the lake. Others froze in their sleep the following nights. Many were wounded, frostbitten, or psychologically shaken by the chaos they had witnessed. And yet the balance of power had changed. The Teutonic advance into the Rus lands was halted. The papacy's ambitions to convert or dominate Orthodox territories via military crusade evaporated. The borders between East and West, between Catholic and Orthodox Europe, had been violently and permanently clarified. And it had all happened on the ice. The myth of the ice breaking. Later accounts, especially those from Russian chronicles, dramatically emphasize the role of the lake cracking beneath the knights. They speak of whole companies plunging into the icy depths, their armor dragging them down like stones. Historians now debate the literal truth of this image. Was the ice thick enough to hold an army? Possibly. Was it thin enough at the edges to cause localized collapses? Almost certainly. But even if only a few drowned, the psychological impact of seeing enemies vanish into the lake would have been profound. It transformed the lake from a surface into a weapon. It made the land itself seem to rise in defense. And over time, this moment became a cornerstone of Russian historical identity. The idea that a small, fragmented Rus army could resist not just invaders, but a papal-backed military crusade, embedded itself in the cultural fabric. And the image of Teutonic knights foreign, armored, proud, sinking into the cold, dark lake became a symbol of outside arrogance undone by native resilience. Faith on the frontier. It's easy to see the battle on the ice as a political or military event, but for the people of Novgorod, it was also about faith. In their eyes, this was not just a defense of land, it was a defense of orthodoxy, of their rituals, their saints, their icons, their language of prayer. Latin Christianity had come with banners, swords, and papal bulls. Alexander had answered with silence, snow, and the weight of centuries-old belief. And when the frozen lake cracked beneath the enemy, it felt, whether coincidentally or providentially, like a sign. In the generations that followed, churches were built in Nevsky's name. Songs and hagiographies compared him to biblical warriors. In 1547, the Russian Orthodox Church canonized him. By then, the story of Lake Peipus had become inseparable from his sainthood. But here's the nuance that so many later depictions miss. Alexander didn't win because of miracles. He won because he understood winter, he understood people, and most importantly, he understood the land. The long silence between East and West. The outcome of the battle on the ice shaped more than regional control. It marked the eastern boundary of Catholic Europe. While the Teutonic Order would continue to campaign in the Baltic, they never again made a serious push into Orthodox Rus territory. In effect, that day in 1242 drew a quiet line through the continent, a religious and cultural fault line that would echo all the way into the modern age. West of Lake Peipus, Latin Christianity, Gothic architecture, and papal authority would flourish. East of it, Orthodox liturgy, domed churches, and Slavic political traditions would hold. And snow would remain a guardian, the ice beneath modern feet. Today, Lake Peipus remains a border between Estonia and Russia. In winter, it still freezes. Locals still fish through holes in the ice. Children skate, and once in a while, a tourist asks where the battle took place. There are monuments now, modest stone markers, a chapel. In 1992, a memorial was built near the village of Kublai to commemorate the 750th anniversary. Russian filmmakers have dramatized the battle, most famously Sergei Eisenstein's 1938 film Alexander Nevsky, with its stirring Prokofiev score and shadowy nights tumbling into cracks of glassy doom. But the real legacy of the battle lies not in cinema, nor in bones hidden beneath the lakebed. It lies in how a young prince, without superior arms or numbers, used winter itself as a weapon. He fought with timing, with terrain, with restraint. He fought a war of silence until the ice broke. A final reflection. And so you must imagine it. A vast lake, a gust of snow, a man standing alone on the shore watching armored shapes move like ghosts across the frost, a hand raised, a quiet command. And then, a moment later, the sound of something cracking, not metal, not bone, but the very world underfoot. And that final question remains. Was it truly the hand of man that shaped history that day, or was it the simple fact that snow, once again, knew no sides, but served those who listened? Story 4. Snowbound at Harjorn, Roman skirmishes in winter Germany. You may think of Rome as a sun-drenched empire, marble villas, olive groves, sandals crunching on warm stone. But the truth is that Rome's reach stretched far into places the sun seldom visited, into forests thick with pine and silence, into hills buried in snow for half the year, into the bitter north, where the Roman eagle didn't fly, it froze. One such frontier was the Harz region in Germania, and one such winter sometime around the early 3rd century CE tested not just Roman power, but its very assumptions. The Harjorn conflict, long forgotten and buried beneath frost and moss, tells a quieter story than Rome's great battles. No named generals, no city taken, no monument raised. Just a skirmish in the snow and the slow erosion of empire. The northern edge of empire. To understand the Harjorn clash, you must imagine Rome's northern frontier not as a line, but as a blur. It stretched along the Rhine and Danube, marked with forts, walls, watchtowers, and uneasy truces with tribal leaders. Beyond those rivers lay Germania, an imagined wilderness in Roman minds. To them, it was a land of barbarians, bearded, cloaked, hostile to order and cities. But it was also a land of opportunity. Trade moved in both directions. So did politics, and so did armies. By the early 3rd century, Rome was already struggling with internal instability. The Severan dynasty was unraveling. Emperors changed frequently. Borders shifted. And Germania, always resistant to Roman control, saw its chance to test the weakened hand of the empire. What we know and what we don't. The Harjorn site, rediscovered in the 2000s, tells us of a Roman military action that was never recorded in surviving histories. Archaeologists uncovered Roman ballista bolts, spear tips, horse gear, and coins from the reign of Severus Alexander, 222-235 CE. And they found them in the wrong place. Too far north, too deep in Germanic territory for a patrol. The artifacts suggested a sizable Roman force had not only ventured into this area, but had fought and won a tactical engagement there. In the snow, while we lack a detailed historical account, the archaeological record paired with what we know of Roman frontier policy helps us reconstruct what might have happened. The winter of an emperor. Severus Alexander, a young and relatively inexperienced emperor, had inherited a fragile realm. To the north, tribes were growing bolder, pressuring Roman forts and trade routes. It's likely that sometime around 233 CE, Rome launched a punitive expedition deep into Germania. The goal: demonstrate strength, dissuade future incursions, reassert the old myth of invincibility. But the timing was poor. The campaign pushed into dense forest, high elevation, and snow-covered passes near the Harz Mountains, terrain utterly unlike the roads and cities of the Mediterranean. The Roman legions, though experienced and disciplined, were ill-suited for cold-weather warfare. Leather bindings cracked in frost. Iron armor chilled the body instead of protecting it. Horses slipped on icy trails. Supply lines slowed, then froze entirely. And then, somewhere near the Harjorn Ridge, the Romans met resistance. The Germanic response. The Germanic tribes, whoever they were in this specific skirmish, understood the land better. They didn't form massive armies. They ambushed, harassed, cut off routes, and isolated cohorts. In snowy weather, movement became soundless. Smoke didn't rise far. Tracks vanished quickly. Roman scouts struggled to read the terrain, let alone anticipate attacks. But they came prepared, as Romans often did. Excavations at Harjorn show that the army had brought with it heavy artillery ballistae on carts, spear throwers, and organized baggage trains. This wasn't a small detachment. It was a deliberate campaign. So why was it there? An unlikely march. Some historians believe the Roman force was retreating. Others argue it was advancing toward a Germanic settlement. Either way, the geography is key. Harjorn lies along a narrow route through hilly terrain, a pass ideal for ambush. The snow would have made this worse. Horses struggled with footing. Wagons stuck in mud or ice. Trees dropped clumps of frozen snow unexpectedly. Communication between units frayed. It was here that Roman forces were likely attacked by a combination of archers, spearmen, and fast-moving skirmishers. Yet the Romans held ground, possibly using their artillery to clear attackers from ridges above. Evidence shows that heavy bolts from ballistae were fired uphill, a rare, desperate tactic. This suggests the enemy had taken the high ground, and the Romans were trying to punch their way through. They succeeded. The corpses of the enemy never buried, left behind fragments of Germanic weapons, suggesting they fought with axes, spears, and arrows. The Romans, while victorious, probably lost many in the process. Life in the cold legion. To imagine the soldiers on that day is to abandon the romance of Roman discipline and see the human struggle beneath it. These were men from across the empire: Africa, Gaul, Syria, now shivering in foreign forests. They wrapped wool cloaks tighter. They stuffed straw into sandals. They tried to light fires with wet pine needles. They watched their breath freeze midair and fell asleep listening for footsteps in the snow. Each step forward was a gamble. Every cooked meal was a logistical miracle. Every dry place to sleep a gift. And still they marched. And when the ambush came, there was no cinematic heroism, just shouts, confusion, metal on metal, and the crunch of bodies collapsing into snowbanks. No songs, no glory. What makes Harjorn so fascinating and so quietly haunting is that it left no mark in history books. No Roman historian wrote of this campaign. No Germanic leader claimed a victory. The artifacts remained buried for nearly 1,800 years, undisturbed beneath layers of soil and forest litter. It was, to both sides, just another day on the edge of the world. But to the empire, it signaled something deeper. Rome was no longer always in control. The frontier was porous. The cold was indifferent, and even the mightiest army could be humbled by snow. And so we ask, how many other forgotten battles never sung, never written lie buried beneath frost and pine, waiting to remind us that history is not made in sunlight alone? The Roman Empire prided itself on order, marching columns, straight roads, and standardized ranks. But beyond the limes, the fortified borders separating the known from the unknown, order had to bend. It bent beneath snow-laden branches, over frost-heaved trails, and under the weight of wind howling through the Germanic woods. And nowhere did this quiet unraveling manifest more than at Harjorn. What began as a frontier show of strength became a slow grind through weather, terrain, and a different kind of warfare. Beyond the edge of maps, the limes marked the frontier, but they were not walls in the modern sense. They were a patchwork: towers, ditches, palisades, and patrols. Beyond them were forests, hills, and peoples who did not write their history in stone. The Harz region was not some distant wilderness. It was, in Roman terms, uncivilized but close enough to matter. Traders passed through. So did emissaries, and so did spies. Roman generals had long sought to tame it, but after the disaster at the Teutoburg forest in 9 CE, where 3 legions vanished into the trees, Rome became cautious. And yet by the early 3rd century, cautious wasn't enough. The tribes had grown stronger, more unified in resistance, more aware of Roman tactics. The Harjorn campaign likely stemmed from this tension, a show of dominance to remind the North that the eagle still flew. The logistical snowball. Roman legions were logistical machines. A cohort on the march carried tents, tools, siege equipment, food, and medical supplies. Roads were cleared, camps fortified, but winter war in Germania brought unique burdens. Food spoiled or froze. Salted pork hardened into inedible blocks. Fires smoked low in wet air, giving away positions. Leather bindings shrank and cracked, turning sandals and straps into liabilities. Bows snapped, their strings brittle from cold. Ballistae creaked with frost, gears seizing unless constantly tended. At Harjorn, evidence shows that Roman troops brought full ballista units, mechanical artillery typically used in sieges. This was not a raid. It was a mobile war machine rolling across frozen ridges, down slippery slopes, and into enemy-controlled terrain. Keeping it all functional in sub-zero temperatures, that took more than training, it took obsession. The ambush reimagined. Imagine now, the skirmish itself likely lasting hours, not minutes. The Germanic tribesmen used the terrain. They did not meet the Romans in open field, but attacked at narrow points, choke points in the pass, where wagons bunched and cavalry had no room to maneuver. From ridgelines above, spears and stones rained down. Screams echoed between icy cliffs. The sound of slipping boots, metal clanging, and horses rearing filled the snow-thick air. Roman shields, damp and heavy, turned sluggish in defense. Cloaks caught on branches. Vision was limited. Panic had no clear direction. And yet the Romans held. They adjusted formations, redirected their ballistae uphill, firing blind at times but effectively. We know this from where bolts were found, lodged high into the embankment soil. These weren't chance shots. They were suppressive fire. One by one, the ambush points were cleared. The line, broken in places, reformed. Roman discipline trained into the bones overrode instinct. And when the forest fell silent again, they did not celebrate. They moved on. What discipline looks like in snow. Discipline in Rome wasn't about shouting orders. It was about repetition. The soldier who could build a rampart in rain, march 50 miles in mud, and fight with numb fingers was more valuable than any hero. At Harjorn, that culture showed. Archers protected their bowstrings by wrapping them inside tunics. Engineers dried kindling under their cloaks as they marched. Units rotated tasks: hourly fire watch, perimeter patrol, gear checks. Medical corpsmen, using vinegar and snow, treated frostbite and infection with improvised knowledge. These were not improvisations of genius. They were the slow, careful grind of trained survival. And this is what allowed Rome to win not overwhelming force, but the refusal to panic in cold. Germanic tactics, familiar with frost. Yet the enemy had their own strengths. The tribes that attacked the Romans, likely Chatti or Cherusci, were not ignorant warriors. They knew these forests. They moved without roads, navigated by stone outcrops and bent branches. They wore furs, not armor, and struck from concealment. Some accounts suggest they used sleds to move faster through snowy valleys. They avoided extended engagement. They aimed to cripple, not conquer. Their plan may have been to trap the Romans long enough that hunger or cold finished the job. But the ambush failed, and when it did, they vanished as quickly as they came. The slow retreat. After the battle, the Romans did not press on. Most likely they turned back, retracing their cold, narrow trail toward the limes. The fight had cost them dearly. The snow took more. Men lost to exposure, supplies buried in drifts, horses pulled down by frost-slick trails. But they returned with knowledge. They now knew which passes to avoid, which tribes to watch, which forest edges funneled into danger. This was how Rome adapted, not by winning easily, but by surviving deliberately. Still, they left behind debris, damaged spearheads, broken wheels, snapped bolts, and a mystery for later generations to find. Silence as a sign. That this battle was never recorded tells us something about Roman perception. Victory was not always worth writing down, especially if it came at great cost, or if it highlighted vulnerability. The Harjorn skirmish was likely considered embarrassing in its risk, even if it ended in survival. It whispered of an empire stretched too thin, marching too far, and now fighting for symbolic value rather than strategic gain. And perhaps that's why the forest reclaimed it. No monuments were raised, no coins minted, just cold, just silence, just snow falling on iron. And so we wonder, was the battle at Harjorn forgotten because it was minor, or because it revealed too much about how close Rome was to losing control? Snow falls equally on the proud and the forgotten. As winter faded from the hills of Harjorn in the early 3rd century, the last Roman boot prints disappeared under a late-season dusting. Fires burned out. Wheel tracks crusted into ice before melting into forest moss. And just like that, the Romans were gone. But for an empire that once claimed to shape the world, the fact that Harjorn left no written trace speaks volumes. It is a story preserved not by scribes, but by silence and sediment, its memory locked in frozen earth and iron oxidized under snow. It tells us about a Rome rarely imagined, not triumphant in marble but stubborn in frost. What the earth preserved. What makes the Harjorn site extraordinary is its preservation not of buildings or statues, but of movement. Archaeologists uncovered ballista bolts embedded in the hillside, sling stones scattered in wide arcs, tools dropped in panic or fatigue. Iron caltrops, designed to cripple charging horses, were found clustered in defensive patterns. Coins minted under Severus Alexander provided dating. The artifacts paint a picture of Roman legions under duress, engaged in a deliberate and desperate tactical response in poor conditions. And while some accounts place the battle during winter proper, others suggest early spring, a time when snow still clings to the higher elevations, when thaw turns trails into rivers of muck, and when every step forward is paid in slipping feet. The takeaway is clear. This was not a show of imperial glory. It was a campaign of friction, of logistics, of bone-deep cold and the weight of armor against wind. The soldiers Rome forgot. No names are recorded, no units identified, no tribunes or centurions were lauded in any surviving document. And yet, the soldiers who fought at Harjorn were likely from elite border legions, perhaps drawn from Germania Superior or even as far as Pannonia. Their daily routines had been shaped by cold. their nights by frostbite, their days by caution. They walked 20 miles a day with packs heavier than a modern infantryman's. They built fortifications at every rest point. They shaved wood damp from snow, hopping it would still burn. They stood watch in sleet, waiting for a horn blast that never came. And when battle struck, they didn't charge heroically. They formed ranks, shouted commands, covered the wounded, loaded their ballistae with frozen hands. They fought not for conquest but to get home. Tactical patience in frozen places. The success of the Roman force at Harjorn despite conditions and ambush reveals something central to Roman resilience: the discipline of endurance. The ballista bolts indicate pre-battle deployment, meaning the army set up firing lines under duress. The distribution of sling stones suggests the enemy used high ground, forcing Roman troops to adapt to unfamiliar elevation. The lack of camp remnants implies mobility, no long occupation, just movement, retreat, or withdrawal. This was not a grand clash like Cannae or Actium. It was a knife-edge engagement in shifting terrain, where every decision was about survival, not dominance. In many ways, it mirrors the larger Roman struggle in the 3rd century, not to expand but to hold on. The empire in retreat. While Harjorn ended in Roman success, it may well have been a strategic failure. Why? Because success did not result in stability. Rome would spend the next century shrinking its ambitions along the Rhine. By the end of the 3rd century, defensive posture replaced punitive campaigns. By the 4th century, large swaths of Germania were written off entirely. The Harjorn battle represents a moment when Rome still tried to impose its will on the frontier. But the cold had a different plan. Snow-like resistance eroded that will slowly, not all at once but season after season. Soldiers stopped volunteering for border duty, roads fell into disrepair, and local tribes grew bolder. One skirmish doesn't collapse an empire, but 1,000 forgotten ones, that's another story. Why was it never written down? There are several reasons Harjorn was never recorded in Roman texts. Political instability. The Severan period was volatile. Emperors rose and fell rapidly. A small victory deep in Germania may have been overshadowed by palace coups or defeats elsewhere. Limited strategic value. While tactically successful, the campaign didn't hold territory or gain resources. It was likely considered routine frontier suppression. Propaganda avoidance. Rome preferred to speak of victory, not vulnerability. Admitting that a significant force faced an ambush far from home might not fit the narrative. Cold warfare was boring. Snow and mud don't inspire marble etchings. The quieter hardships of Roman soldiers were rarely commemorated unless tied to major geopolitical shifts. But archaeology doesn't need propaganda. It tells us what lived in the cracks of imperial silence. The Harjorn of today. Modern visitors to the Harjorn site walk forested trails where no roads remain. Signs and subtle markers describe the archaeological finds. In winter, snow still blankets the ridge. Trees still creak in wind, and the air holds a familiar stillness, the kind that once made legionaries grip their gladii a little tighter. Nothing in the landscape screams Rome. There are no broken temples or crumbling baths, just the slope of the hill, the line of sight, the faint shape of a battlefield not built for spectacle. It is, in its own way, a Roman Pompeii of silence. But rather than preserved in ash, it's preserved in frost. Snow as Rome's quiet challenger. In Harjorn, snow served not as a battlefield hazard, but as a philosophical reminder that no empire can master all terrain, that not all enemies wear uniforms, that frost doesn't respect maps or eagles, and that sometimes survival is the only victory worth nomming. Rome met its match not in a great rebellion, but in 1,000 little resistances, slippery paths, foggy ridgelines, quiet ambushes in the cold. And so the soldiers at Harjorn stood, not for conquest but for cohesion, for one more mile home. A final reflection. Imagine the last man of the column, marching away after the ambush, dragging a broken spear and squinting against flurries. His fingers are cracked, his cloak stiff. He does not sing. He does not shout. He listens for the sound of pursuit and hears only snow landing on pine. He doesn't know that his skirmish will be forgotten. He only knows he survived it. And so we ask one last time, is the strength of an empire found in its victories, or in the quiet resolve of men who marched through snow, leaving nothing but footprints behind? Story 5. The Battle of the Ice and the Cleric Knight Conflict. You may think of crusades as sun-drenched sieges and desert crossings, helmets shining beneath a Levantan sun, knights clashing outside Jerusalem. But not all crusades followed the same path. Some moved north, not south, into lands of pine and birch, into valleys where the rivers froze early and thawed late, into a silence punctuated not by prayer but by the crunch of iron on snow. This was the Northern Crusades, a lesser-known series of religious wars in the 12th and 13th centuries, sanctioned by the Pope, not against Muslims, but against pagans and Orthodox Christians in the Baltics. And at its heart stood a conflict between two ideas of faith, two worlds, and, ultimately, two armies brought together on a frozen lake. But to understand the so-called Battle of the Ice, you must first understand the Cold War of belief that preceded it. The Northern Crusades, God's work in the snow. In the early 1200s, the Roman Catholic Church had become increasingly concerned about the spiritual direction of Europe's northeast. The Baltic region, modern Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and parts of western Russia, was seen as a region of spiritual disorder, a place of heathens and schismatics. Some local populations were pagan. Others had adopted Christianity through Byzantine channels, embracing Eastern Orthodoxy. To the Latin Church, both were problematic. And so, crusade was declared not just against pagans, but also against Orthodox Christians who refused to bow to Rome's authority. The Livonian Order, an offshoot of the Teutonic Knights, took up the mantle. Germanic Crusader knights flooded into the region. Forts were built. Local leaders were replaced or subjugated. Orthodox churches were looted or converted. To the west, it was holy work. To the east, it was occupation. A cleric in armor, the dual role of the Teutonic Knight. The Teutonic Order was unique. Its members were not just warriors, they were clerics. Monk knights sworn to poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet clad in full armor, wielding longswords and enforcing papal policy with fire and steel. They marched under banners adorned with black crosses on white fields. They sang psalms before battle, and they believed with utter certainty that they were bringing salvation by force, if necessary. But beneath this spiritual veneer was a very real political ambition. The Teutonic Order carved out its own state in the Baltic, a militarized theocracy that taxed local populations, demanded fealty, and waged war as routine. Their expansion was calculated, strategic, and when winter came, relentless. Unlike most medieval forces, the Teutonic Knights did campaign in cold seasons. Their order trained to fight in snow. They developed winter routes for supply. Their horses were bred for northern terrain. They knew how to build fortified camps in frost-hardened soil. This made them terrifying opponents for any who resisted. Orthodox resistance. The Eastern Church draws a line. While pagan resistance in the Baltics continued, especially among Lithuanians, the Orthodox Christian population in what is now northwest Russia grew alarmed. For them, the conflict wasn't about conversion. They were already Christian, just not Latin Christian. They crossed themselves differently. They spoke Church Slavonic, not Latin. Their priests married. Their icons looked east, and they did not acknowledge the Pope as the head of their church. As far as Rome was concerned, This was unacceptable. As far as Novgorod was concerned, this was sacred. Alexander Nevsky, the young prince of Novgorod, had risen to prominence for his resistance against the Swedes and the Mongols. Now he turned his attention westward, where the Livonian order had seized Pskov and began harassing Orthodox communities along the borders. This was not just war, this was religious assertion. Winter tactics, a matter of faith and frost. Nevsky had learned from watching the Mongols and the Swedes that timing was everything. His army was smaller than the Crusaders, less disciplined, and far less equipped in terms of metallurgy and formal training. But his men knew the terrain, and more importantly, they knew winter. He recruited archers from the forests, spearmen from the Volga basin, and cavalry from among the local boyars. His troops wore fur, wool, and leather not because it was elegant, but because it kept them alive. They didn't build castles, they built snow walls. They didn't rely on paved roads, they used frozen rivers. And they didn't believe in holy war. They believed in holy land that held the bones of their ancestors, the foundations of their churches, the ashes of their hearths. To them, the Teutonic Knights were not saviors, they were invaders. The road to the ice. By early spring of 1242, Nevsky had pushed back against the Livonian incursion into Pskov. The Teutonic Knights, furious and determined to reassert dominance, mobilized a force to engage him. They moved eastward across the frozen landscape, expecting the Orthodox army to retreat into the woods. Instead, they found them waiting near the frozen surface of Lake Peipus. The Livonian army was smaller than expected, possibly around 500 men, but made up of elite knights and well-trained foot soldiers. Nevsky's force was larger, perhaps 5,000, but composed largely of militia and local irregulars. And between them lay a frozen lake, its surface shimmering beneath the spring sky, its edges softened with thaw, its center still firm. It was April 5th. The lake held, for now. The stage was set. What they fought for, what unfolded that day, was more than a military engagement. It was a theological collision, an ideological confrontation played out on the most ephemeral of battlefields. The Teutonic Order sought to enforce Rome's vision of Christendom uniform, hierarchical, Latin. Nevsky's army fought for a world where different expressions of faith could coexist: orthodox, communal, localized. And all of it, for that one day, came down to cold breath, frozen armor, and hooves on ice. And so we ask, in a war of belief, where snow covers the earth and clouds obscure the heavens, does God take sides, or does the frost decide? Dawn broke slow and pale over Lake Peipus on April 5th, 1242. The lake, vast and silent, shimmered with a thin crust of frost. The sky held a dull pewter hue, the kind that smothers sound. In the far distance, two armies stood in tense quiet, their breath forming clouds, one under the black cross of Rome, the other beneath the banner of Novgorod, no imperial standard, just a symbol of stubborn, frost-hardened faith. As the sun rose, light danced on ice. For a brief moment it seemed no one would move, and then, with the sudden rhythm of hoofbeats, the Teutonic Knights advanced. The ice would soon remember every footfall. The Teutonic charge. The Germanic knights had spent decades hunting their strategy. Their core doctrine was simple. A wedge of armored cavalry would smash through enemy lines, supported by infantry, archers, and sometimes local conscripts. Their success depended on discipline, shock value, and weight. On the frozen surface of Lake Peipus, they applied the same approach. They formed up in a tight, triangular wedge, knights at the front, heavy with mail and plate, lances leveled. Behind them came swordsmen and spearmen, along with Estonian auxiliaries. As they surged forward across the ice, hooves clattered with unnatural clarity. Armor shivered with each stride. The sound was less of thunder and more of brittle percussion echoing across the flat plain, bouncing from one frozen breath to the next. But the ice did not crack, not yet. Alexander's defense: shallow depth, wide breadth. Alexander Nevsky was not a general in the classic Western sense. He had no formal staff, no rigid formations. His force was drawn from a wide swath of territories: lightly armored Novgorod militia, experienced steppe horsemen, archers from the northern forests, and Orthodox faithful willing to die for land and liturgy. He knew his troops couldn't withstand a head-on cavalry charge. So he didn't let them. Instead, Nevsky arrayed his men in a crescent formation, thin at the center, thick at the sides. He allowed the Teutonic wedge to punch through the middle. His goal was not to stop them. It was to pull them in. And once they were surrounded, once the knights had exhausted their momentum and reached the thinnest part of the ice, his flanks would collapse inward. This wasn't just strategy, it was weathered cunning. The clash on the lake. When the Teutonic charge hit Nevsky's center, the snow seemed to explode. Men were thrown back, shields shattered. The center line gave way, retreating deeper onto the lake, drawing the knights with them. For a few moments it looked like the battle was one: crosses pushing eastward, pagans and schismatics scattering. But then the trap closed. From the flanks, Rus' cavalry swept inward. Light and fast, they did not aim to duel, they aimed to disrupt. They hacked at reins. They stabbed at legs. They circled, forcing the heavily armored knights to turn again and again on the slippery surface. The Teutonic formation began to twist inward. Discipline frayed. Orders became lost in wind. The weight of armor, once an advantage, became an anchor. The knights found themselves encircled, and beneath them the ice began to groan. The myth of the breaking ice. One of the most famous images of the battle on the ice is that of Teutonic knights plunging through cracks into freezing water, armor dragging them under, black crosses vanishing beneath the lake. But how true is it? Contemporary Russian chronicles mention knights falling through the ice. Later accounts, especially those from the 15th century onward, amplify this image into something near mythical. By the 20th century, the idea of mass drowning had become symbolic: God and nature defeating arrogance. Historians today debate the scale of this event. Some argue the lake would have been thick enough to hold the weight. Others suggest that areas near the river inlets, shallow and uneven, may have had thinner ice, particularly after a full day of sunlight and combat. What we know is this: chaos erupted mid-battle as knights lost footing, visibility dropped, and formations collapsed. Bodies were found later in shallow water, and some reports speak of drowning. The panic of slipping and falling while surrounded was real, even if only a few broke through the ice. So whether the lake truly opened up like a trapdoor, or merely swallowed a few in slush and confusion, the effect was the same. The Teutonic charge was broken, not by steel, not by fire, but by ice. The clerics in panic. For all their spiritual authority, the cleric knights of the Teutonic order were human. And in this moment, human fear overtook holy purpose. They had charged in the name of God. They now fled in the name of survival. Estonian auxiliaries broke ranks first, fleeing toward the shore. Knights followed. Horses slipped, throwing riders. Swords were discarded to run faster. Some begged for quarter. Others simply vanished, last seen crawling over fractured ice toward the riverbanks. Nevsky, ever cautious, did not pursue recklessly. His troops followed at range, picking off stragglers but avoiding deep pursuit. The battle had already been won. And as the sun lowered over the lake, the wind picked up again. The snow began to fall. What remained after the silence? When it was over, the ice bore no banners, just blood, drag marks, broken arrow, a shield half buried in slush. Nevsky did not celebrate lavishly. He didn't need to. His message was clear. Novgorod would not bow to Rome. Orthodoxy would not be conquered by Latin crusaders. And faith, when rooted in soil and snow, could withstand the sharpest blade. Survivors from the Teutonic side limped west. The Livonian order entered negotiations soon after. While border skirmishes continued, the dream of converting or dominating Novgorod was effectively ended. This wasn't just a battlefield victory, it was a doctrinal defense. Echoes in ice. In later centuries, Russian Orthodox tradition would elevate the battle on the ice to sacred memory. Nevsky became a saint, his victory a symbol of divine protection. But beneath the myth was a colder truth. Faith is not only defended in churches. Sometimes it's fought for on ice surrounded by silence, smoke, and the sting of wind in your eyes. And so we must ask, in a war of holy orders and ancient rites, was it the sword, the prayer, or the frozen lake that truly decided the outcome? As the sun set on Lake Peipus on April 5, 1242, the battlefield was still. The cries of dying men had faded, absorbed by snowdrifts and the gentle groaning of the ice beneath. All that remained were the traces of a great collision between faiths, between powers, and between ways of seeing the world. The blood that had darkened the snow would soon vanish, washed away by spring melt. But the memory would not. What happened on that lake, on that frozen mirror between east and west, left a crack not only in the ice, but in the very fabric of Christendom. A line drawn on ice. Before the battle, the Pope and his crusading orders dreamed of a unified church, Latin-speaking, papally guided, rooted in Rome. The Northern Crusades were part of that vision, a way to bring the Baltic and Russian lands into the Western fold, under banners of both cross and crown. After the battle, that dream froze solid. The defeat of the Teutonic Knights at Lake Peipus was not just a military failure. It was an ideological defeat. The Orthodox Church, already beleaguered by Mongol pressure and internal strife, had held its ground. The crusading orders would shift focus in the years that followed. Their attention turned west and south once more. Though they remained active in the Baltic, their attempt to convert the Orthodox through force essentially ended here, on this silent battlefield of snow and ice. Alexander Nevsky had done more than protect Novgorod, he had preserved a worldview. Saint, strategist, survivor. Nevsky's canonization came centuries later, but already in his lifetime he became a figure larger than most rulers, revered by peasants, trusted by nobles, tolerated by Mongols, and feared by Western enemies. He died young, in 1263, possibly from exhaustion or illness acquired during years of difficult rule and endless negotiation. But his legacy endured not in the way of tyrants or empire builders, but in the subtle strength of a man who chose his battles with care. He did not seek open confrontation with overwhelming foes. He negotiated with the Mongols rather than die in feudal resistance. He conserved Novgorod's autonomy by quiet, strategic submission in one direction, while fiercely defending it in another. He knew that some enemies could be waited out, others had to be met in the snow. And so, the battle on the ice became a defining moment not of conquest, but of preservation. Memory in the snow. Over the centuries, the battle took on symbolic power. In Orthodox tradition, it became a divine victory, holy warriors defending true faith against encroaching heresy. In Russian nationalism, it became a rallying point, proof that the East could resist the West. In Soviet propaganda, it was used to portray Nevsky as a proto-commander, defending the homeland from foreign invaders, notably in Sergei Eisenstein's 1938 film Alexander Nevsky. In modern memory, it lingers as one of those rare battles where nature, faith, and cunning converged in a perfect moment of defiance. But strip away the layers, and what remains is this: a frozen lake, a young prince, a people refusing to bow, and snow that bore silent witness. A Cold War before the Cold War. It's tempting to view the Battle of the Ice as a medieval anomaly, a curious clash in a forgotten corner of the world. But in reality, it was one of the earliest, clearest geopolitical fractures between East and West that would echo down the centuries, not in terms of empires, but in terms of spiritual authority. The papacy had assumed its right to lead all Christians. The Orthodox Church, rooted in Byzantium and local traditions, disagreed. The frozen lake became a battlefield not just for land, but for the soul of Europe. The schism between Catholicism and Orthodoxy, formalized in 1054, became real at Lake Peipus. After this, there would be no more serious Latin efforts to bring the Orthodox Church under Rome's control via military crusade. A theological front had been established, drawn, poetically and practically, on a frozen lake. Weather as weapon again. Like so many other episodes in this long-form historical series, the environment played a role that was less dramatic, but more decisive than any sword. Ice slowed the charge of the heavily armored Teutonic cavalry. Snow obscured movements and helped hide Nevsky's flanks. Cold punished the wounded, hastening death and confusion. Terrain dictated tactics, not ideology or bloodline. And just as in Novgorod's near siege or Toten's snowstorm, here too, survival came not from brute force, but from adapting to the weather. Those who understood the cold, not just endured it, survived. Legacy in the landscape. Today, Lake Peipus straddles the border between Estonia and Russia. No ruins stand on its shore. No iron relics poke through the surface, but the lake remains. In winter, it freezes over. Fishermen drill holes into the ice. Snowmobiles hum across, and beneath the crust, quiet stillness remains. Locals still speak of the battle sometimes as history, sometimes as myth. The bones have long vanished, but every winter the lake remembers. It reflects the sky exactly as it did that morning in 1242. It creaks beneath the weight of modern boots. It holds and it waits. A final reflection. Picture it one last time. A knight cloaked in fur rises from a fall. His sword lies nearby, half frozen into the surface. Around him the wind cuts across the lake. He looks up and sees no banners, just snow, just silence. He walks away slowly, stiffly toward the edge of the ice, uncertain whether he will find land or water beneath his feet. He does not know what this battle will mean. He only knows he lived through it. And so we ask, is the shape of history drawn in blood or in the quiet line where ice turns to water? Story 6. Blizzards before gunpowder, Swiss pike squares in the Alps. There are few places on Earth where snow is not a seasonal nuisance but a constant force. In the medieval Swiss Alps, snow wasn't whether it was terrain, calendar, and battlefield all at once. Long before the invention of gunpowder rifles, before the sharp crack of muskets echoed through alpine passes, warfare here was conducted in steep silence. And the Swiss, famously neutral today, were once some of the fiercest soldiers in Europe, peasant warriors fighting not for conquest, but for their mountains, their freedom, and their survival. And they fought not in cavalry charges or glittering halls, but in snow-choked valleys with long wooden pikes backed against cliffs, their breath fogging in the mountain air. This is the story of how the Swiss used winter, terrain, and the simple geometry of a square to repel the powers of Europe. The rise of the Swiss Confederacy. By the late 13th century, the regions that make up modern-day Switzerland were a patchwork of alpine valleys, mountain passes, and rural communities loosely tied to the Holy Roman Empire. Life in these places was hard. Winters were long. Roads were treacherous. The soil was poor, but the people were resilient. And they valued independence. In 1291, several cantons, the rural alpine regions, formed the Eignissenschaft, or Swiss Confederation, pledging mutual defense against outside overlords. Their primary opponent would be the powerful Habsburgs, who claimed feudal rights over much of the land. The mountains became more than geography. They became strategy. The Swiss were not interested in expansion. They fought only when the lowland lords came up the valleys where snow, slope, and rock turned armies into floundering masses. And when they fought, they used pikes. Pikes and the birth of the square. The Swiss military innovation wasn't the weapon itself. The pike, a long spear, often 12 to 16 feet, was ancient, but the formation was revolutionary. Swiss infantry fought in tight squares or columns, facing outward on all sides, bristling like a porcupine of wood and iron. These pike squares could stop cavalry charges, trap enemy infantry, and even move across uneven terrain if drilled correctly. In snow, they were even more effective. Horsemen struggled on narrow, icy trails, armor froze, hooves slipped, but a line of peasants, boots wrapped in leather, pikes planted in slush, could hold a mountain path for hours. Discipline mattered more than strength. And cold made discipline easier to impose. It focused the mind. It limited chaos. It forced men to rely on formation, not frenzy. The Winter War of Morgarten, 1315. The first major test of Swiss resolve came in 1315 at the Battle of Morgarten. The Habsburg Duke Leopold I led a force of heavily armed knights and infantry toward the canton of Schwyz, planning to punish the rebels and reassert imperial control. He chose a route through a narrow mountain pass near Lake Egerie. It was a tactical mistake. The Swiss, outnumbered and lightly armed, prepared a winter ambush. They blocked the path with felled trees. They waited on higher ground, and as the Habsburg army advanced through the icy bottleneck, they attacked with stones, arrows, and then with pikes. The Habsburg knights had no room to maneuver. Slippery slopes and sudden snow made the path a death trap. Horses fell. Armor became burdens. And then the Swiss came down from above shouting, stabbing, pushing. It was not a pitched battle. It was a collapse. By the end of the day, the Habsburg army was in full retreat. The Swiss had defended their autonomy, and the mountain pass, blanketed in snow and blood, had told a story louder than any trumpet. Why winter favored the Swiss? In almost every engagement between the Swiss and their wealthier enemies during the 14th and early 15th centuries, winter or alpine terrain played a critical role. Here why. Cavalry was ineffective. Elite knights, the core of European armies, were nearly useless on steep, snowy slopes. Armor was a liability. In cold weather, chainmail froze, joints stiffened, helmets iced over from breath. Navigation was difficult. Snowfall covered paths. Avalanches were a constant threat. The Swiss used goat trails and local guides. Surprise favored locals. Swiss ambushes were frequent, well-timed, and merciless. Supplies froze. Armies reliant on long supply lines suffered when their bread turned to stone and their wine froze in barrels. The Swiss, meanwhile, adapted. They wore layered wool and fur, trained with pikes on snow-covered fields, and built fires from green wood. They dug snow shelters. They dried meat in chimneys. Their armies were militiamen who farmed in summer and fought in winter. They knew how to fight with the weather, not against it. Training in the cold. Swiss military culture was built around communal responsibility. Every male citizen was expected to train with weapons, especially the pike or halberd. Winter drills were common, held in packed snow to mimic battlefield conditions. They practiced marching in formation uphill through snow, reforming ranks on slippery terrain, holding square formations under simulated attack, driving pikes into packed snow to anchor against charge. Failure wasn't punished with humiliation. It was corrected with repetition, because in real war, a broken square meant slaughter. The cold made these drills harder, and that was the point. Discipline forged in snow held fast in fire. The Habsburgs learned slowly. Despite their defeats, the Habsburgs and other European powers continued to send professional armies into the Alps to crush the upstart Confederacy. But each time the pattern repeated. Armies advanced during the wrong season. Swiss forces chose the ground carefully. Surprise attacks were launched in poor weather. Pike squares held the line and pushed back. At Sempach, 1386, and Neffels, 1388, the Swiss once again used terrain and weather to stunning effect. Their victories weren't about numbers. They were about knowing when and where to strike. Snow was not just a setting, it was a tactic. And so we ask, when pikes meet snow and iron meets ice, what truly decides the battle bravery, weapons, or the mountain's quiet refusal to let outsiders pass? By the time the 15th century dawned, the Swiss Confederacy had built a reputation far greater than its size might suggest. It was still a collection of loosely allied mountain cantons, with no king, no nobility of note, and no grand cities commanding vast trade routes. But it had something else. It had a reputation forged in snow. No invading army, be it Austrian, Burgundian, or Imperial, could ignore what the Swiss had become. A people who could hold a line in a blizzard, turn goat trails into killing grounds, and transform untrained farmers into iron-willed infantrymen. And at the heart of it all was a simple shape, the pike square, and a willingness to freeze before they would bend. The pike square, simplicity in form, complexity in execution. The Swiss square was not an elegant maneuver. It didn't involve rapid cavalry wheels or glittering banners. It was functional geometry, adapted for snow and slope. Each square consisted of multiple ranks of pikemen, usually in a deep rectangle or block formation. The front 4 to 5 rows held their pikes level, presenting a dense wall of sharpened wood and iron. Those behind helped push, stabilize, or prepare to step forward as needed. In winter conditions, the square served multiple purposes. Visibility, when fog or snowfall obscured the battlefield, staying tightly packed ensured coordination. Traction, linked arms and compressed ranks helped prevent slips and collapse. Flexibility, a square could turn or pivot to face new threats, crucial in narrow passes or winding trails. Psychological defense, for men standing in freezing wind, knowing others pressed close behind and beside them kept morale from cracking like frostbitten fingers. When enemies saw the Swiss square braced in the snow, they faced more than men, they faced an immovable idea. The Battle of Neffels, 1388, snow as out. In April 1388, during the Wars of the Glarus Rebellion, the Habsburgs again tried to assert control over a rebellious Swiss canton, this time Glarus. The timing was poor. Snow still covered the higher ground. The trails were slippery and unstable, but the Austrians assumed they could outmatch the smaller Swiss force. Their army numbered around 5,000. The Swiss defenders had fewer than 500. But the Swiss had something the Habsburgs did not: control of terrain, local support, and the weather on their side. The Austrians advanced up narrow, icy routes toward the town of Neffels. Snowfall limited their sight. Once inside the valley, their flanks became vulnerable. As they tried to navigate the slopes, the Swiss counterattacked not from the front, but from above, rolling rocks and logs down the mountain paths, then swarming with halberds and pikes. The Austrian line fell into chaos. Units scattered. Many tried to retreat across the Linth River, but the spring melt had swollen it. Snowmelt turned the banks into sludge. Hundreds drowned or were cut down at the water's edge. Neffels became one of the greatest Swiss victories. And once again, it had been won by climate, cohesion, and cunning, not by numbers. The Burgundian Wars, winter against wealth. By the 1470s, Charles the Bold of Burgundy, one of the richest men in Europe, launched a campaign against the Swiss. He brought with him modern artillery, armored cavalry, and a well-trained army. But Charles had never fought in snow. The Swiss had never fought without it. At the Battle of Morat in 1476, Swiss forces used forests, rain, and muddy ground to slow Charles's advance. Their squares emerged from tree lines with sudden speed, smashing into Burgundian flanks before cavalry could respond. Charles's elite knights slipped and bogged down. Swiss halberdiers swept through with practiced efficiency. In a matter of hours, the battlefield was a field of broken lances and muddy banners. Charles tried again at Nancy the next year. He died there. His body, stripped and frozen, was found days later in a ditch. He had learned too late. Wealth and armor meant nothing in the face of mountains and resolve. What cold taught the Swiss? The Swiss didn't invent war, but they perfected survival in it. Hear what winter taught them. Stay still unless you must move. In snow, motion creates noise and exposure. Keep tight formations. Snow muffles orders. Distance means death. Use the terrain, don't fight it. Let enemies come to you, tired, disoriented, and frostbitten. Weapons don't need to be fancy. A well-placed pike does more than a sword in slippery hands. Clothing is armor. Wool and fur matter more than steel when the temperature drops. Winter warfare was not glorious. It was miserable, but misery for the Swiss became habit. Habit became tradition. Tradition became strength. Discipline beneath the snowline. The Swiss did not always win. They suffered defeats, but even in failure, their enemies took note. These were not mere peasants. They were professional in all but name, trained not in academies, but in valleys, barns, and snowy hillsides. Their military success fed directly into their political independence. European kings learned not to invade lightly, and eventually, they learned to hire the Swiss instead. By the 16th century, Swiss mercenaries were among the most sought after in Europe. But that's another story. In these earlier days, they fought not for coin but for canton, and they sharpened their pikes not with ceremony but with snow. A footprint in the frost. When you walk in the Alps today, the landscapes remain mostly untouched. The trails are still steep, the valleys still narrow, snow still clings to the ridgelines well into spring. Somewhere under that snow long ago stood a square of men, silent, breath misting, pikes leveled. They were not waiting for glory. They were waiting for the enemy to come closer. And so we ask, in the cold geometry of resistance, is the greatest strength not in attack, but in simply standing when all the world expects you to slip? By the end of the 15th century, the Swiss Confederacy had done something nearly no one else in Europe had managed. It had survived. Survived against empires. Survived against invasions. Survived in snow, mud, and ice. It had taken no kings. It had claimed no grand thrones, and yet it stood, because when winter came, as it always did, the Swiss didn't retreat. They braced. They locked shields. They lowered pikes. And they endured. From defense to demand, the reputation of the Swiss. Victory in the Alps didn't go unnoticed. By the late 1400s, the rest of Europe had realized that Swiss pikemen were no longer just mountain militias. They were a disciplined, hardened military culture, equal parts citizen and soldier, shaped by cold and community. And so, the Swiss were no longer merely defending their valleys. They were being invited out of them. By 1500, Swiss mercenaries were in high demand, especially by French, Italian, and Papal armies. Their pike squares were considered unmatched in Europe. Even the formidable Spanish tercios, with their blend of firearms and spears, had to adjust their tactics in response. But something changed in this shift. Once peasant defenders of their own soil, Swiss fighters now marched across borders into warmer lands. They fought in Italy, in France, in the Low Countries. But the ones who stayed, the ones who still trained on frost-covered hillsides, remembered why their ancestors had formed those squares in the first place. The cold logic of independence. What made the Swiss remarkable wasn't just their military success. It was how that success translated into sovereignty. While much of Europe's politics was dominated by royal marriages and dynastic claims, the Swiss cantons operated on mutual oath. They were a confederation, not a kingdom. Decisions were made in alpine town halls, not palaces. Defense was communal, so was hardship. And snow was the great equalizer. In the Alps, even the wealthy couldn't escape the cold. There were no soft winters, no grand hunting estates. Everyone lord or laborer had to prepare, stockpile, and endure. That shared struggle forged a society that resisted external control not through fiery rebellion, but by making conquest logistically impossible. You could invade the Swiss valleys in summer. You might even win a skirmish. But winter always came, and then the mountain belonged to the men who'd never left it. The Pike Square as a philosophy. In war manuals of the period, the Swiss square was described with geometric admiration. A block of 100 men in 10x10 formation. Pikes at 60 degrees in the front, horizontal in the center. Flank guards with halberds and short swords. Coordination by drumbeat and flag, adjusted for wind and visibility. But for the Swiss, it was more than a tactic. The square represented community. No man could succeed alone. No flank could hold without the others. The front row died first, but never without being replaced. Everyone from baker to shepherd trained in the same drills. In snow, those lessons became literal. Slip, and your comrade holds you up. Break formation and the whole line buckles. Stand together and even a storm-battered road becomes a fortress. The Pike Square wasn't just a defense. It was an ideology of unity. The limits of cold. But not all snowstorms bring salvation. By the early 16th century, the world was changing. Gunpowder was spreading. Fortifications were evolving. Battles became longer, more static. In these new conditions, even Swiss pikes met their match. At the Battle of Marignano in 1515, Swiss forces suffered a devastating defeat at the hands of French troops supported by artillery and armored cavalry. Their square, once unbreakable, was softened by cannon fire and maneuver. They still fought bravely, still held formation, but the battlefield had changed. And so too would Swiss foreign policy. After Marignano, Switzerland began to embrace neutrality not because of weakness, but because of wisdom. They had learned what mattered wasn't conquest, it was survival, and for that, cold hills and closed borders were better defense than any treaty. Snow and statecraft. The reputation earned in the snow became a political asset. Other nations came to view Swiss neutrality as a form of quiet strength, a people so disciplined that they did not need to expand, a people who did not collapse under pressure because they'd already endured centuries of it from the mountains themselves. Switzerland's topography made occupation impractical, its internal cohesion made division unlikely, and its history of winter war of waiting, watching, and counterattacking from the slopes made it clear. These were not lands to be held lightly. The snow had taught them not just how to fight, but how to govern themselves. The modern echo. Today, the Swiss Pike Square is a relic of history. You won't find one on the battlefield. But its legacy remains etched into the cultural memory of a nation that still trains for civil defense, still guards its passes, and still lives with a quiet, calculated pride. You can visit the valleys where the squares once stood, the fields where pikes bristled, the narrow paths where invaders slipped and fell. You can feel the cold wind as it rushes down the ridgeline. And in that moment, you might understand. It wasn't firepower that defended Switzerland. It was formation in the frost. A final reflection. Picture them one last time. A square of men, boots in snow, faces chapped, shoulders tight, each man holding a pike longer than himself, eyes forward, no trumpets, no drums, just the sound of wind between pine trees and the knowledge that behind him stood a neighbor, and behind that neighbor another. Together they formed a square, not just of soldiers, but of sovereignty. And so we ask, is it possible that true strength lies not in conquest, but in the cold stillness of a people who refuse to be moved? Story 7. Mongols in the Snow, Subutai winter campaign into Europe. The image most people have of the Mongol army is tied to sun-baked steppes, endless grasslands, and scorching campaigns stretching across Asia. But that image is only half the truth. For one of the most remarkable Mongol generals, the cold was not a hindrance, it was a canvas. And in the winter of 1241, that canvas was Europe. His name was Subutai. He didn't ride alone. He brought an army designed for mobility, silence, and shock. What followed was one of the coldest, most calculated, and devastating winter campaigns in medieval history, a lightning war in snow, orchestrated not by brute force, but by logistics, deception, and frigid efficiency. This is the story of how snow did not slow the Mongols, it amplified them. The architect of Mongol warfare. Subutai was not born into nobility. He came from a humble background in the Uriankai forest tribes and began his service under Genghis Khan as a teenager. Over time, he became one of the Khan's most trusted commanders. By the time of the European campaign, Subutai had already helped conquer parts of China, Central Asia, Persia, and the Kievan Rus. But Europe was different. It was unknown terrain, rugged, cold, forested, and filled with fortified cities. Subutai's solution: plan years ahead. Strike during winter. Break the rules of traditional warfare. While most European armies disbanded in winter, the Mongols thrived in it. Why snow suited the Mongols? To most medieval European powers, winter meant logistical paralysis. Supply lines froze or were snowed in. Horses and oxen could not forage. Rivers became impassable. Roads turned to icy death traps. But to the Mongols, many of whom hailed from the frigid plains of Mongolia and Siberia, these were not obstacles, they were advantages. Frozen rivers became highways, allowing rapid flanking maneuvers. Snow-covered terrain slowed enemy messengers, but Mongol couriers were adapted to it. Enemy cities relaxed their guard in winter, expecting no major movement. And critically, Mongol horses could dig through snow to find grass. European war horses, they could not. Subutai saw all this, and he designed his entire campaign around it. The prelude, scouting, and division. Long before the first snow fell on Europe in 1241, Subutai had already been watching. For years, Mongol reconnaissance teams disguised as traders, monks, or migrants had traveled through Poland, Hungary, and beyond, collecting detailed maps, assessing fortress walls, counting horses, and learning dialects. Then, as winter deepened, Subutai began to divide his forces. Instead of moving as one mass, the Mongols split into multiple detachments. One group headed toward Poland. Another moved into Transylvania. A third feinted in the south to distract the Bulgarians. This wasn't random. It was orchestration. Subutai's winter campaign would culminate in a simultaneous strike against Europe's core while it was still half asleep in snow. January 1241, a frozen advance. As European kings and dukes celebrated Christmas and Epiphany in their halls, the Mongols were already advancing. Snow blanketed the Carpathian Mountains. Cold winds swept across the plains. Most medieval armies would be in winter quarters. But the Mongols moved with precision. They carried dried meat and fermented mare's milk, needing no resupply for weeks. They brought herds with them, feeding off their own livestock. Their warriors wore layered furs and silk, giving warmth and flexibility. Horses were rotated regularly. Each rider had 3-4 mounts, keeping the army fresh and mobile. This allowed them to cross distances European scouts thought impossible in winter. The Battle of Liegnitz, Smoke and Snow. In April 1241, as winter gave way to early spring snows, one of the key Mongol thrusts struck at Liegnitz, Legnica, in modern Poland. A Polish-led force, including Templar knights and local feudal levies, moved to intercept what they believed was a small Mongol raiding party. But Subbutai's men were masters of deception. They feigned retreat, drawing the European knights away from their advantageous position. The Mongols used smoke bombs and dust, enhanced by snow glare, to confuse the enemy's vision. When the trap was sprung, it was too late. Polish cavalry charged, expecting to break a weakened force. Mongol horse archers dispersed and encircled. Precision volleys of arrows rained down. When confusion peaked, heavy Mongol cavalry crashed into the flanks. Liegnitz was not a large battle by numbers, but it was devastating in effect. European command structures collapsed under speed and miscommunication. And the snows around Liegnitz. They muffled retreat. They highlighted blood. Marching through ice, the Carpathian challenge. While Liegnitz fell, Subbutai himself led the main army through the Carpathian Mountains, a daunting task in any season, but particularly in snow-covered March. The mountains were steep, the passes narrow, but Subbutai planned for it. Engineers used axes and picks to clear paths. Ice was used intentionally to speed sledges across frozen ravines. They constructed makeshift corduroy roads from felled trees to support carts. The European defenders assumed the snow would prevent movement. Instead, it became a shortcut. The result: when Subbutai emerged on the Hungarian plain, the enemy was unprepared. The trap at Mohyj, coming soon. The true culmination of Subbutai's winter brilliance would come at Mohyj, on the Sajo River. But that is a story for the next section. For now, what remains clear is this. Winter was not an enemy to the Mongols. It was a co-conspirator. They moved when no one else dared. They struck from directions considered impassable. They adapted to snow, cold, and ice not with brute force, but with precision. And so we ask, when snow blinds the proud and cold paralyzes the prepared, is it not the quiet hoofbeat in winter that signals the coming storm? The Hungarian plain is vast and open, flanked by rivers and ringed by mountains. In the spring of 1241, that openness became a trap engineered by one of the greatest military minds the world has ever known. The Mongols, having crossed the snow-laced Carpathians in silence, emerged like frost-cracked lightning onto the Hungarian kingdom. Their goal wasn't pillage. It wasn't even conquest, at least not in the traditional sense. It was to send a message and erase resistance. At the center of this operation was Subbutai, now in his 60s, still sharp, still cold, and still committed to delivering one of the most terrifying envelopment maneuvers in medieval warfare. What followed would echo not just across Hungary, but through all of Europe's winter-lulled courts, and it began on the banks of the Sajo River, near the village of Mohyj. A kingdom unready. Hungary in 1241 was not a backwater. It was a powerful Christian kingdom, well connected to Europe, but it had no experience facing armies like the Mongols. King Bela IV had gathered a large feudal host estimated between 25,000 and 30,000 men, including heavy cavalry, crossbowmen, and foreign allies. They established a camp near the Sajo River, assuming they'd have time to organize a response. Subbutai had other plans. He did not engage them directly. He let the snowmelt and overconfidence do part of the work. The Hungarian forces, weary from a long winter, were lulled into believing the Mongols would not strike with full force so soon after crossing the Carpathians. But Subbutai had been building bridges literally while they debated. The tactical setup, ice in the veins, On the night of April 10th, 11th, 1241, Subutai moved under the cover of darkness and light snowfall. The Mongols built pontoon bridges upstream of the Hungarian camp, hidden by terrain and river bend. Then, as dawn approached, they launched a feint at the existing stone bridge the Hungarians guarded. This was classic Subutai. Draw attention with a loud attack. Let defenders commit. Then hit them from where they least expect. Hungarian forces rushed to defend the stone bridge, believing they were holding the critical crossing point. Meanwhile, Mongol heavy cavalry began crossing the hidden bridge upstream, fanning out into the flat plain beyond. By the time the Hungarian command realized what was happening, their lines were caught between two converging forces. The encirclement at Moh. Once the full weight of Subutai's army entered the field, the classic Mongol envelopment began to unfold. Cavalry hit the Hungarian flanks. Horse archers harassed from distance, picking off commanders and creating confusion. The rear guard, tasked with protecting the camp, found themselves attacked from behind. Then came the psychological strike. The Mongols launched incendiary devices and smoke bombs into the camp, using the wind to blind and disorient. Panic set in. Horses bolted. Crossbowmen lost visibility. In the confusion, the Hungarian army collapsed into itself, trapped between the river and the Mongol lines. Subutai had effectively built a killing bowl, using terrain, weather, and precision. He didn't just defeat the Hungarians, he unmade their army. The role of weather. The campaign around Mohi wasn't fought in deep winter, but the tail end of it. Snow still blanketed the higher elevations. Mud, frost, and sudden cold snaps shaped every movement. Subutai understood this. His logistics officers had prepared winterized carts for moving siege equipment. Scouts ensured ice thickness on rivers for crossing. Messengers used layered furs and silk undergarments to maintain speed in cold wind. Horses were given rotating rest, as the terrain was hard on hooves and joints. The Hungarians, on the other hand, relied on feudal levies, many of whom arrived late due to impassable roads or frozen rivers. When the battlefield is cold, slowness is death. The aftermath, a kingdom in ashes. The Hungarian defeat at Mohi was total. Thousands of soldiers died. Command structures collapsed. King Bela IV fled westward, eventually seeking asylum in a fortified coastal city. What followed was a scorched path across Hungary. Mongol forces burned villages, destroyed fortresses, and broke any remaining resistance. Cities that resisted were reduced to ash. Those that surrendered were spared briefly. By summer, the once proud kingdom was crippled. But Subutai didn't stop there. He had coordinated multiple fronts. Liegnitz in Poland to draw away reinforcements. Transylvania to control the eastern flank. Mohi to destroy the core. Every movement had been timed, every delay calculated, and every winter challenged snow, ice, mud, river, cold weaponized. Why it worked? Subutai's campaign is still studied for its genius, and winter played no small part in that success. Frozen rivers were used for mobility. Snow-covered trails made detection difficult. Ice-induced overconfidence weakened enemy vigilance. Cold-season logistics surprised European foes used to seasonal warfare. It wasn't just about being tough, it was about being ready. The Mongols planned for snow. They moved through it as if it were any other terrain. And that adaptation shocked Europe, where kings assumed war ended when the first frost fell. The sudden retreat. Then in early 1242, just as Europe prepared for total collapse, the Mongols vanished. Subutai and the other commanders received word. Urgidei Khan, son of Genghis and the current Great Khan, had died in Mongolia. By Mongol law, all princes and generals were summoned back for the Kurultai, the selection of a new leader. And so they packed up, crossed rivers, melted snow trails behind them, and disappeared into the east, leaving behind scorched villages, abandoned armor, and a shaken continent. Europe was spared not by resistance, but by Mongol custom. And so we ask, what if Urgide had lived another year? What if Subutai had not turned back? Would Vienna have fallen in spring snow? Would France have known hooves on its vineyards? Would Europe's great cathedrals lie in smoking ruin? Or did winter not just serve as a weapon, but as the witness to a crossroads never crossed? The Mongols came with the frost, and they left like a thaw. In just over a year, from late 1240 through the spring of 1242, Subutai's winter campaign stunned, shattered, and reshaped the political geography of Eastern Europe. No medieval army had ever moved so far, so fast, or with such precision during the cold season. No enemy had calculated the seasons, rivers, and roads with the same mathematical intensity. And no one, not even the Mongols' enemies, fully understood what had just happened until the last hoofprint was covered by fresh snow. When the Mongol armies disappeared back over the Carpathians, they didn't just leave behind broken kingdoms and burnt villages. They left behind an idea that winter no longer guaranteed safety. The legacy of Subutai's campaign. Subutai's campaign didn't just win battles, it redefined warfare. The old European model of feudal military response, seasonal levies, summer skirmishes, and winter retreats had been shattered. Never before had a military force used snow and frost as tools of acceleration, rather than obstacles. The Mongols brought year-round campaigns, a revolutionary concept in a world where armies disbanded after the harvest. Frozen river logistics, transforming icy barriers into highways. All-weather cavalry tactics, thanks to horses conditioned for cold, snow, and long distances. Psychological domination, using winter raids to create panic in courts that expected peace. For Subutai, who never ruled as a Khan or prince, this campaign was a final masterpiece. By the time he returned to the east, he had outmaneuvered entire kingdoms and broken the illusion that geography or weather alone could protect a people. A new kind of terror. In the aftermath of the campaign, Europe was gripped not just by mourning, but by paranoia. Would the Mongols return? Would they wait for summer or strike again in snow? Was any city safe if even rivers could be crossed in frost? Papal envoys were dispatched as far as Karakorum, bearing gifts and begging for peace. In Hungary, Bela IV began a frantic program of castle-building fortresses with stone towers and deeper walls. New maps were drawn. Armies began experimenting with mobile winter formations. A continent that once dismissed winter warfare as foolish now saw it as essential to survival. The silent lessons in logistics. Subutai's brilliance was not rooted in cruelty or even in combat. It was in logistics. His troops traveled over 500 kilometers in deep snow without losing cohesion. They built temporary bridges across rivers still crusted with ice. They scouted mountain passes even in blizzards. They rotated horses for warmth and endurance. European armies had relied on slow-moving carts, noble-led levies, and seasonal rhythms. Subutai's forces were mobile in cold, fed by dried mutton and fermented milk, guided by scouts who had crossed Eurasia more than once. In the world of medieval warfare, where most generals counted victories in fields of summer wheat, Subutai planted his in snowbanks. Why didn't they return? Historians have debated this endlessly. Why did the Mongols, having utterly destroyed Hungary and routed Poland, simply stop? The official explanation is clear. Urgide Khan had died. The generals, Subutai among them, were legally and culturally obligated to return east for the Kurultai. But would they have returned anyway? Hear what we know. The Mongols never established permanent supply lines into Europe. Their system of horse stations, YAM, required vast infrastructure. Forested terrain in Western Europe was harder for mass cavalry movement. Disease and fatigue were setting in. Europe, though divided, was beginning to learn. Subutai, ever pragmatic, may have recognized that winter had given him the element of surprise, but that surprise would not last forever. The lesson had been taught. Europe would not forget. Snow as a strategic variable. After 1241, snow was no longer just a seasonal nuisance in European military thought. It became a strategic consideration. Roads were improved to allow for all-season response. Local militias began training in snow-covered terrain. Campaign calendars were rewritten, no longer stopping at harvest time. The Mongol threat pushed regions to adopt year-round readiness. In effect, Subutai forced an early modernization of European military thinking, at least in the East. Even if they didn't return physically, the Mongols haunted European planning for generations. Subutai's silence. Unlike many generals of his era, Subutai left no personal memoirs. No chronicles, no embellished tales. What we know of him comes through Chinese, Persian, Russian, and European accounts, many of them awestruck or confused. But the simplicity of that silence makes his legacy louder. He did not seek to be remembered as a tyrant. He did not crown himself king. He rode in snow and sun, through more than 20 campaigns, never defeated. And perhaps that is why his ghost still rides in the cold fog of early spring. Not as a man, but as the idea that winter cannot protect you, and that readiness does not hibernate. The echo in the Alps. Years later, when Swiss pikemen stood in snow-covered passes, or when Russians began building fortresses deep into their forests, they were not only defending against their neighbors. They were defending against the memory of Mongol speed, Subutai's planning, and the uncanny way cold turned invincibility into vulnerability. Snow was no longer a blanket of peace. It was a canvas of war. A final reflection. It's easy to imagine snow as silence, as purity, as something that halts, that hides, that comforts. But in 1241, it was none of those things. Snow was movement. It was disguise. It was the soft drum under hoofbeats that shook kingdoms. And one old general, with maps, horses, and an iron will, used it not to warm by the fire but to shape the edges of empires. And so we ask, when the snow falls again and armies rest, is it truly peace they feel? Or is it just the pause before a hoofbeat in the frost? Story 8. The Siege Beneath the Snow, Novgorod's Winter Walls. At the far end of medieval Europe, beyond the frost-bitten forests of Muscovy and across the frozen lakes of the north, lay a city that was never quite conquered, never quite tamed. Its name was Novgorod, the New Town, though by the 13th century, it was already old by Russian standards. It was not the largest city in the Rus, nor the wealthiest, but it had something few others possessed. It knew how to survive winter sieges. And in a land where snow fell early and stayed long, survival wasn't just about swords and walls. It was about firewood, boots, frozen rivers, and knowing how to make ice your ally, not your grave. This is the story of a siege that didn't quite happen, and a city that outlasted both enemies and the cold. Novgorod, where the north begins. In the 1200s, Novgorod was a republic in a time of princes. It had a vetch, a kind of assembly or town council, and elected officials not by bloodline but by consensus. It controlled rich trade routes stretching from the Baltic Sea to Byzantium, and its wealth came not from conquest but commerce. It was also uniquely placed. To the west, Catholic powers crusading with both zeal and ambition. To the south, Mongol-controlled territories seething with tension. To the north, freezing marshland and forests hard to conquer, harder to live in. Its winters were punishing, Temperatures regularly dropped below 20 degrees C, 4 degrees F. The Volkhov River froze. Roads turned to ice. Trade slowed. But Novgorodians didn't flee the cold. They built their identity around it. A siege in the snow. The Teutonic Knights arrive. In the early 1240s, Novgorod's greatest threat didn't come from Mongols, but from the west. The Teutonic Order, a military-religious group of German knights, launched a series of campaigns into the lands of the Eastern Slavs. Their aim, to expand Catholic control into Orthodox territory. Their assumption, that Novgorod, snowbound and isolated, would fall quickly. The Teutonic Knights were armored, well-funded, and emboldened by crusading indulgences. They believed themselves spiritually and militarily superior, and in fair weather they might have been. But they brought their campaign into the Russian winter. And Novgorod was waiting. Winter defense tactics, no movement, only endurance. The Novgorodians knew their landscape. They didn't try to meet the knights in open battle, not in the deep cold. Instead, they withdrew into their Kremlin, a fortress within the city, and sealed the gates. Their strategy relied on pre-stocked granaries filled in summer, thick timber walls, frozen hard by months of sub-zero wind, snow-choked moats, too deep to cross, too slippery to tunnel, ice-covered rivers patrolled from above. They also used civil discipline. The entire population had drills in place for snow sieges. Every household was assigned a fire watch. Children gathered snow for melting, clean water. Waste was disposed of through frozen tunnels. Fires were built into earthen pits to reduce smoke visibility. In Novgorod, winter defense was not a reaction, it was a culture. The siege that stalled. When the Teutonic Knights reached the city, they found no defenders in the field, just silence, snow, and high walls. They tried to breach the city gates, but their siege engines froze. Lubricants for wheels and joints stiffened. Iron shattered more easily in the cold. Horses panicked at sudden snowdrifts. They tried to tunnel, but the ground was permafrost, impossible to dig without weeks of fire prep. Then came the food problem. The knights had assumed a quick victory. They hadn't packed for a long winter siege. Their supply trains got bogged in snow. Local peasants fled or burned their own stores, practicing scorched earth. Soon the knights were living off frozen grain and the meat of dead horses. Inside the walls, Novgorod had fish from its cellars, dried berries, smoked elk, salted cabbage. And patience. Ice's barrier, Ice's blade. One of the most surprising aspects of Novgorod's winter defense was how it used ice. Frozen moats were broken up in pre-planned patterns, forming spike-like traps under the snow. Ice blocks were stacked and insulated with straw, making makeshift external walls or decoys. On cold, clear nights, patrols used the glare of moonlight on snow to spot distant movement. In one documented case, Novgorodians lit fires on thin ice outside the walls, hoping that approaching enemies would step into newly melted patches disguised by powder snow. The cold wasn't just endured, it was weaponized. Why the knights failed? The Teutonic siege failed not because of a heroic charge or overwhelming counterattack, but because of attrition and cold miscalculation. They underestimated Novgorod's preparation. They misunderstood the stamina required for snowbound warfare. They could not adjust their tactics to terrain and temperature. Eventually, the knights withdrew, leaving behind frozen tents, rusted chainmail, and the half-buried bones of those who died not by sword, but by exposure and starvation. Novgorod had not needed to win a battle. It had needed only to outlast the snow. And so we ask, in a world obsessed with bold charges and shining victories, is there greater strength in stillness? Is it possible that the most resilient defense comes not from fire and steel, but from knowing how to survive the cold without ever needing to open the gates? The Teutonic Knights had failed to take Novgorod, but their ambition had not thawed. The icy rebuke they suffered outside the city walls in 1240 and early 1241 did little to stop their broader campaign into the northern Russian territories. For them, Novgorod was merely the first prize in a long chain of imagined conquests, and so they continued seizing towns, intimidating settlements, and pushing their black and white banners deeper into the frostbitten lands. But Novgorod was not done. While the city had survived the winter siege by shutting itself in, it was never a people content to wait forever, especially not under the leadership of Alexander Yaroslavich, later known to history as Alexander Nevsky. In spring 1242, as the rivers began to unfreeze and the snowpack receded, Alexander led his counteroffensive not with vengeance, but with calculation. And it would culminate in one of the most famous winter battles ever recorded. The battle on the ice, fought on the frozen expanse of Lake Peipus. Who was Alexander Nevsky? At the time of the siege, Alexander was a young prince in his early 20s. His military and political acumen were not yet widely known, but Novgorod's Vetch had chosen him for one key reason. He understood both foreign threat and domestic resilience. He had already defeated a Swedish invasion at the Battle of the Neva in 1240, from which he earned the name Nevsky, and he knew how to maneuver diplomatically between the Mongols to the east and the crusading powers of the west. Alexander also understood something else. War in the north wasn't about pride, it was about timing. You didn't fight when the ground was too soft. You didn't charge when the ice was too thin. You waited until the cold was your ally, not your executioner. And when that moment came, you struck with precision. The Teutonic occupation of Pskov. The Teutonic Knights, licking their wounds after Novgorod, shifted their focus to Pskov, a smaller but strategically located city further west. There, they established a foothold, bolstered by Estonian and Germanic auxiliaries. They began to build supply networks and recruit local collaborators. To them, it was a manageable territory, one they could rule through strength and winter fatigue. Alexander, however, saw the occupation of Pskov not just as a territorial loss, but as a test case. If Novgorod allowed it to stand, it would invite further incursions. And so, in the late winter of 1240-1242, Alexander began a carefully calculated campaign to retake Pskov. But more than that, he began laying bait. March 1242, drawing the knights onto the ice. Alexander retook Pskov in a swift and coordinated operation, driving the garrison knights out and reclaiming the city for Novgorod. Rather than retreating to safety, the Teutonic Order decided to respond with a show of force. They gathered their knights armored, mounted, and still believing in the superiority of their cause, and began to pursue Alexander's smaller force eastward. And Alexander let them. He withdrew slowly, luring them across icy terrain. Scouts ensured that paths were firm enough to support Novgorodian infantry, but would become increasingly treacherous under heavy, ironclad cavalry. By early April, Alexander had chosen his battleground. Lake Peipus, still frozen wide open and surrounded by flat, snow-dusted terrain. A field of ice. A trap if set correctly. The armies. The forces were uneven on paper. The Teutonic Knights fielded around 2,500 men, including 400-500 mounted knights in full armor. Alexander's Novgorodian army numbered roughly 4,000-5,000, primarily infantry, with some light cavalry and militias. The knights relied on shock power, a heavy cavalry charge designed to break formations. The Novgorodians relied on terrain, endurance, and timing. April 5, 1242, the battle begins. On the morning of April 5, under a pale sun and a chill breeze, The Teutonic Knights charged across the frozen lake. Their horses thundered over the ice. The sound echoed. The steel flashed. It was the kind of charge that had broken pagan lines in the Baltics, pagan tribes in Prussia, and frightened kings in Livonia. But Alexander had arranged his men in layers. The front ranks absorbed the impact and began to collapse by design, drawing the knights inward. The flanks, hidden in snowbanks and behind ridgelines, closed around the knights in a crescent. Archers pelted the German cavalry from the sides, targeting horses and unshielded gaps. Light infantry began pressing in, hacking at armor, avoiding frontal clashes. Then the ice began to break. Myth versus reality. Did the ice crack? Medieval chronicles, especially later Russian sources, claim that the ice shattered beneath the weight of the armored knights, sending many to their deaths by drowning. Modern historians debate this. The ice may have been thick enough to support the battle, but soft enough in certain areas to fracture under repeated stress, especially as retreating knights grouped tightly together. Even if the entire army didn't fall through, the psychological impact was real. Panic spread among the knights. Horses slipped and collapsed. Mobility was lost. Retreat became disorder. The Novgorodians pushed hard, not with overwhelming force, but with calculated pressure, letting the environment do half the work. Aftermath: victory in the cold. The Teutonic forces broke. Some fled back toward Estonia, others were captured, a handful drowned or died of wounds in the snow. Alexander didn't chase them far. He didn't need to. He had made his point. Novgorod was not a passive city. The Orthodox Rus were not a frozen relic. Winter wasn't a season of rest, it was a battlefield. The battle on the ice became a symbol of religious defense, national resilience, and environmental warfare all at once. The cultural impact. Alexander Nevsky's victory was immortalized not just in chronicles, but in folklore, art, and even 20th century propaganda. Sergei Eisenstein's 1938 film Alexander Nevsky turned the battle into a cinematic myth. Soviet historians used the story to frame Russian resistance to Western aggression. The Russian Orthodox Church canonized Alexander as a saint. Yet beneath the myth, the reality remains remarkable. A young prince used ice and timing to defeat a superior enemy. A northern republic adapted itself to survive siege and war in the harshest season. And winter, once thought a military pause, became a strategic tool. And so we ask, can victory come not from strength, but from patience? Not from fire and force, but from understanding the freeze. And when the lake refreezes each year under modern skis, do we still hear the hoofbeats on the ice? Novgorod never became an empire. It did not forge legions or crown a czar. And yet, through centuries of siege, storm, and slow encroachment, it stood longer than many of its rivals. The secret: not overwhelming might, not blessed geography, but an intimate generational knowledge of winter, of how to live with it, fight in it, and endure beneath its weight. Novgorod's story is not about conquest. It is about survival. After the battle on the ice, the Teutonic Order's defeat on Lake Peipus in 1242 did not end Western incursion into Rus lands, but it delivered a clear signal. Winter warfare would no longer favor the ambitious, only the adapted. Alexander Nevsky returned to Novgorod as a hero, but his eyes were already turned eastward. He would later submit diplomatically to the Mongols, believing that resisting them militarily would mean annihilation. This choice preserved Novgorod's autonomy for decades, while other cities like Kiev were crushed under Tatar hooves. And so, the city once threatened by two fronts, Mongol and Crusader, found a precarious balance. A cold peace in a colder land. Winter as identity. Over the centuries that followed, Novgorod's people did not forget the ice. It became part of their cultural and political identity. The Vetch continued to meet, even in deep winter, the sound of bells echoing over snow-covered rooftops. Granary reserves were not merely stocked, they were ritualized, tracked by priest and merchant alike. Ice roads over frozen rivers became formal parts of trade routes. Wooden walls gave way to stone Kremlins, but the firewood stacking systems in households remained as they had for centuries. Defense plans assumed a siege in snow. Even in peacetime, drills were conducted in January. Where other cities went dormant in the cold, Novgorod trained. They did not fear the frost, they counted on it. The hidden infrastructure of cold. What made Novgorod unique wasn't just its attitude, it was its engineering. While grander cities built monuments, Novgorod refined the mundane. Underground drainage systems ensured snowmelt didn't flood cellars. Layered storage barns were insulated with straw and clay. Winter marketplaces were held on frozen rivers, temporary but stable. Warning horns echoed across white landscapes, testing sound in fog and frost. Even the city's layout was winter-conscious. Narrower lanes to reduce wind tunnels, elevated thresholds to keep out drifting snow, and dense woodpiles stacked in communal corridors. This wasn't luxury, it was survival protocol. And unlike other cities of the medieval world, Novgorod expected, not dreaded, a siege in snow. The Mongol absence and influence. Though the Mongols devastated much of the Rus, Novgorod was spared destruction thanks largely to its diplomatic submission and careful tribute paying. But the Mongol shadow still loomed. Roads were monitored,